In 2006, Susan Lewis and her daughter Jamie discovered the perfect Southern California home in a quiet community. They immediately loved the modest, perfectly sized house. Their home was a haven where they could start a new life. Matt, Susan's new boyfriend, joined them shortly after they moved there, improving things. It started a blended family. Matt and Jamie got along well, which relieved Susan. Matt also had a daughter, Marie, Jamie's age. Immediate friendship formed between the girls. Everything was wonderful briefly. Susan and Matt were happy, the daughters were happy, and this little house was the shelter they needed. This idyllic family started a new chapter. That ideal picture was about to be shattered, starting with a jar of peanut butter. Matt, Jamie, and Marie were enjoying the pool on a sunny summer day a few weeks after everyone had settled in. They were laughing, splashing, and having fun. Susan took a break from the festivities to make lunch for everyone inside. As she entered the kitchen, she spotted it. The kitchen counter had a peanut butter jar on its side. A lid was off. Not the strangest part. Peanut butter poured out of the jar like a liquid. As if melted, it gently oozed across the countertop and dripped into the floor. Susan felt the kitchen air. It was warm, but not hot enough to melt peanut butter. Her first thought was that a child did it. Maybe they came inside, microwaved the peanut butter for some odd reason, and left it as a prank. Anger drove her to the rear door to call for her daughter. "Jamie, get in here!" Jamie, still dripping from the water, entered bewildered. "What, Mom?" she asked. Susan pointed to the counter mess. Jamie later said she chuckled at her mom's silly question. "Did you do this?" "Why would I?" she asked. Susan asked, "Well, I don't know." "Do you know if Marie did this?" Jamie shakes her head. "No, we've been outside the whole time." Susan sent her outside and called Marie, believing her daughter. Like Jamie, Marie was confused as she entered. She replied, "No, I didn't touch the peanut butter." Susan looked from the mess to the two innocent girls. She sighed. She thought one of them wouldn't admit it, but it was a lovely day, and she didn't want a spilled jar of peanut butter to ruin it. It was rationalized in her head. One of the youngsters may have knocked it over accidentally and been too scared to admit it. It may have melted because the kitchen was warmer than she thought. She convinced herself there were a dozen rational answers. It turned out she didn't care enough to make a big deal. Susan returned outside after 10 minutes of cleaning up the sticky, oily mess, and the four of them spent the afternoon in the sun and pool. Once the sun fell, they headed inside. The moment they entered, they sensed something was seriously wrong. After leaving, the house was different. Cans of pantry food were stacked on every second-floor stairwell. Some beans, maize, and soup cans were stacked haphazardly, forming a quiet obstacle course. But it continued. Random objects in odd patterns littered the house as they entered. Shampoo and conditioner bottles were arranged in a teetering pyramid on the tub edge. They had a flawless star pattern of hairbrushes and combs on the counter. They opened the microwave and found several peanut butter jars, some vegetable cans, and even some of the girls' teddy animals. The cleaning materials were neatly lined up on the floor under the kitchen sink, from shortest to tallest. Next came walls. Sprayed and splattered strange liquids covered the living room and kitchen walls. It looked like ketchup, mustard, or other sauces, but they weren't sure. Shampoo and soap stains made the walls slimy and sticky. Their immediate impression was that an intruder had broken into their home and robbed them. They hurried back outside, hearts racing, and searched the land. But nobody was there. Nobody had entered the residence all afternoon. They would have seen a car or person enter their driveway. Confusion and fear led them to capture what they saw. They returned inside and took pictures and videos of the unusual scenes on their phone. This is why we have so many photos today. None of it made sense to them. Their thinking told them this was a hoax, but who would pull it? Jamie was suspicious by Matt immediately. He assumed his non-biological daughter was behaving out. Susan thought it was Marie, Matt's daughter. Matt and Susan had a terrible fight over this quick blame game. It started a serious breakup in a nice blended family, and things became worse. Try to imagine their situation. Parents don't want to believe in supernatural events. Some kid is responsible, which is the most plausible but painful answer. If it's not a child, a stranger was in your home touching your things. What if it's not an intruder? The idea was too terrible to consider. So they believed the other person's child was guilty. They were convinced beyond reason. This conviction and need to blame someone prevented them from calling the police, which they should have done immediately. That call never happened. Instead, they began the laborious cleanup. They spent hours cleaning up the house while a dense, seething stillness permeated the air. After finishing, they sought to go on like denial-stricken folks. However, their sanctuary's weird events continued. About a week passed. The house was still tense, but they were attempting to forget the can and sauce incident. Jamie and Marie tried to spend time together one afternoon in Jamie's room. Marie worked on homework at a desk next to the bed. Jamie poured her freshly brewed coffee on the desk next to Marie. "I have to go use the bathroom. I'll be right back," she added. She turned and left the room, disappearing for a while. Marie returned with her head down, looking preoccupied with studying. Jamie returned into the room and discovered the coffee cup gone from the desk. Her white bedspread was covered in dark brown coffee when it was thrown. The room was empty except for Marie. Jamie became furious. "Marie, what are you doing?" "Why did you throw my coffee all over the bed?" Marie looked up from her schoolwork, stunned. She asked, "What are you talking about?" After following Jamie's gaze to the bed, she appeared as astonished as Jamie. "I didn't do that," she said. Jamie didn't trust her. This seemed like another of her odd tricks to garner attention, as she still believed Marie had made the large mess in the house the week before. Jamie left the room for cleaning supplies, frustrated. Her bleach bottle was placed on her dresser when she returned. Open dresser drawers held her clothes. She placed the bleach bottle upright on the smooth wood. She then took up the empty coffee mug from the bed and put it on the desk. She froze when she turned to grab bleach. She was spilling bleach over her clothes in her open drawers because the cap had been unscrewed. A constant flow of transparent, corrosive liquid ruined everything. Jamie could see Marie sitting on the chair the whole time. She remained still. Jamie was convinced it wasn't Marie. She screamed. Marie screamed when she saw bleach everywhere. Susan ran inside the room after hearing the noise, screamed, "What's going on in here?" The frightened girls tried to explain what happened, but their statements were inaccurate. A wall-mounted picture frame tumbled to the floor as the three of them stared at the damaged garments. It startled them all. Another picture fell after they stared at the empty wall. A loose nail or poster dropping could be a coincidence. However, two photographs descending simultaneously felt different. Susan witnessed the photos falling, the bleach and coffee, and her daughter and stepdaughter's utter terror. She grabbed both females and they fled. They hurried out of the home, got in the car, and drove away without a destination. They realized they couldn't stay in that house. A huge plot twist occurred. Jamie and Marie had silently accused each other of the strange events until now. Though they never stated it, it helped them make sense of the turmoil. Susan had been mentally blaming one or both girls. Now that she had seen the portraits come off the wall, Susan was beginning to suspect that something supernatural was happening in their home. Jamie and Marie were convinced. They were the first to express it as they drove aimlessly. They suspected their home was haunted. Susan and the girls drove home when they calmed down. Matt was at work all day and didn't know what happened. They returned inside with heavy hearts. The house failed again. Cans stacked up the stairs, stuff in unusual patterns on the floor, the microwave was filled of various goods, and the refrigerator door was open, spilling food onto the kitchen floor. Strange, sticky liquids covered the walls again. No one was responsible this time. Susan, Jamie, and Marie spent the entire vehicle ride together. Matt wasn't home, so none of them were it. Their terror was heightened by this fresh proof, coffee, bleach, and falling photos. The concept of a haunted house became unsettling. Matt returned home that night to turmoil and 3 worried family members. Instead of worrying, he got more persuaded that this was a prank. He hadn't seen the bleach pour alone, not seeing the images fall from the wall. All he saw was his girlfriend, Susan, believing this crazy claim that their house was haunted. Matt was a skeptic and refused to entertain any other explanation other than his girlfriend's trick. He and Susan had a huge fight. He claimed she encouraged the youngsters' imaginations. She said that he didn't comprehend and that the house was broken. They yelled at each other. They cleaned the house again while fighting, taking forever. The idyllic family was shattered at the end. Susan and Matt loathed each other, the kids were squabbling, and their sanctuary was gloomy and oppressive. Things worsened that night. The house lost power instantly. They were plunged into darkness and heard doors banging open and shut all night. The electric ignition on their stove kept clicking, as if trying to light a burner. They couldn't turn it off. Bang, 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 click, click all night. They saw all this paranormal activity and recorded part of it, but fear and unbelief paralyzed them. Nobody knew what to do. From the outside, it's simple to suggest they should have contacted the police or left the house. However, a situation like that upends your universe. This challenges all you thought you knew about reality. Your brain switches on denial to cope. Instead of uniting against whatever was in their house, they fought and blamed each other for the things that were clearly happening in front of them, things that had nothing to do with them. Susan, Matt, and the girls hadn't notified their friends or relatives yet. They were humiliated and afraid of being disbelieved. Susan finally snapped the next day. She told a close friend everything. Peanut butter, cans, bleach, smashing doors. Her friend listened carefully and gave odd advice. Maybe you should try giving it a peace offering, she added. Maybe this thing in your house feels like you're intruding on its space. If you offer it something to show you mean no harm, that you want to coexist, maybe it'll stop. Whether this advice was good or not, Susan felt in control for the first time. She embraced the notion. Matt would be at work that day, so she knew he would never approve. It would start another fight when he called it absurd. So she saw an opening. She told the girls the plan. Susan chose a little porcelain cat figurine for the offering. Cats were her passion, so she thought offering them would be powerful. She said, "We mean no harm. Let's call a truce." She set up a little table with candles and a cat figurine in the middle. Observing her, the females were unsure what to think. Susan talked from the heart since she didn't know what to say or how to ritualize. "Please accept this gift," she told the empty room. "It's my gift to you. We mean no harm, and we want to coexist." Fate brought Matt home quickly. The noise had kept him up the night before, and he was so sick and fatigued that he left work early. He entered his house and observed Susan and the girls performing a seance. He was mad. "Definitely not," he said. "We are not going to interact with this thing. We're not going to act like it's real, because it's not." He stepped to the table and saw the cat figurine was the focus. Susan and the girls begged him, "Don't do anything! Don't touch it!" But Matt ignored them. He grabbed the figurine from the table, went to the back deck, and flung it into their backyard. Susan and daughters cried. He had made things worse, and they were afraid. All eyes were on the backyard where the cat landed. But they turned and glanced at the table. They all gasped. The same cat figurine was in the middle of the table where it had been seconds earlier. It was impossible. Everyone had seen Matt chuck it. Matt refused to change. He didn't care. He ran back over, grabbed the new figure, and tossed it on the floor, shattering it into 100 pieces. The violence and aggression were the reverse of Susan's peace offering. At that moment, Susan felt a sickening feeling in her stomach and knew they would suffer for what he had done. Jamie woke up in the middle of the night after everyone had wept themselves to sleep. She discreetly went downstairs to the kitchen for water because she was thirsty. Her blood chilled when she entered and turned on the light. The kitchen walls were covered in ketchup-like writing that repeated one word: cat. She saw cat everywhere. She shouted and went upstairs, waking everyone. Everyone descended and saw the signs. Matt instantly faced Jamie. "You're the one that found this." "You did this," he said. Susan defended Jamie. "You're the one who smashed the cat figurine, Matt." "No wonder this is happening." It escalated into another terrible brawl, with everyone screaming and blinded by rage and terror. They were haunted and could only pull each other apart. Beyond the writing on the walls, the residence was looted again. The contents of every drawer were spilled on the floor. Every closet was open, clothes scattered. Extremely messy, unlike anything they had seen before. Nobody had woken up. Everyone slept in their beds and heard nothing. It wasn't rational. As they began another unpleasant kitchen cleanup, they shifted some objects and found something new. A large, muddy footprint was on the linoleum floor. It was bigger than Matt's foot and not Susan's or the girls'. It was a giant man's footprint, or something else. Again, we can easily ask why they didn't go. When in chronic turmoil, your brain craves normalcy. A coping method. They did nothing. They cleaned up the debris, washed cat off their walls, and tried to survive in a house they couldn't afford to leave. Family dynamics had collapsed by this stage. The kids were shy and terrified. Marie and Jamie stayed in their rooms all day. Matt and Susan barely spoke. The house was now a jail, and everyone was sad. In the last 2 weeks of their time in that residence, 2 frightening events forced them out forever. Marie experienced it first. One evening, she was home alone for 2 hours. Susan and Matt hated leaving her, but they had to. Jamie went out with buddies. As night fell, Marie was home alone. Similar to a horror film scene. TV was her distraction in the living room. TVs started turning off and on suddenly. Fast, rhythmic, on, off, on. She understood from experience that this was a terrible sign indicating trouble. She couldn't turn the TV back on after it fully switched off. The remote flew off the coffee table and skidded across the floor as she reached for it. She was stuck in fear, sitting there. She knew others were there. She then watched in terror as the empty rocking chair in the corner of the room started rocking slowly, then more vigorously, as if an invisible person had just sat down and was watching her. Marie watched the rocking chair as the portraits on the walls fell to the floor one by one. Marie and Jamie started carrying a digital camera around to chronicle weird events. Marie grabbed her camera while scared on the couch. With shaking hands, she aimed it around the room and started taking shots, trying to capture something. She ran for her phone and called Susan, her dad, and anyone who answered. She said, "You have to get here now." "Something's happening!" Susan and Jamie ran home to find Marie huddled on the couch, scared but unharmed. The house was thrown again. After things calmed down, Marie remembered the camera. "I took pics," she stated. The small computer screen displayed her images, which they viewed together. She appeared in numerous photos with weird, dazzling orbs of light in the living area. Their movement around the room was obvious. It proved something was there. It was the last straw for Matt. He could no longer deny it. Pictures showed his daughter was terrorized. He eventually believed their home was haunted. The church was his first stop because he didn't know who to call. He contacted priests and pastors to invite guests to the house. He could only get one priest to pray with the family for a few minutes before declaring, "I can't help you," and leaving. They were alone in a house they couldn't afford to leave, with a growing threat. Jamie's second major event, which broke them, occurred at home alone. In her bedroom, she heard a loud door hammering. Thump, thump, thump. Nobody else was home, she knew. Fearful, she grabbed her camera and filmed the door, recording her frightened breaths. Someone was repeatedly knocking on her bedroom door. She knew she had to check the hall. She moved toward the door, her heart racing, gathering the confidence to turn the handle. The beating on the other side stopped when her hand approached the doorknob as if it knew what she was about to do. The beating resumed when she retracted her hand. She went back to her bed and curled up in the fetal position for 3 hours, listening to somebody bashing her door. The banging ceased abruptly. Jamie believed she could depart the house after a few minutes of silence. She crept back to the door, cautiously turning the knob and opening it. The hallway was vacant. No one was there. When she peered outside her door, she saw a huge dent in the wood where the pounding had occurred. It appeared that a huge force had bent the hallway doorknob downward. A filthy mound of pots, pans, silverware, and knives covered the hall floor. It appeared that something was trying to smash her door with tools. The doorknob to the restroom next to her room was gone, leaving a space where you could look through. They hadn't replaced it yet. The bathroom light flickered as Jamie stood in the corridor. It's in there, she thought. In an odd flash of boldness, she decided to trap it. She hurried back to her desk, grabbed thread, and returned to the restroom door. She threaded the string through the doorknob hole, closed the door, and leaned back, thinking she had trapped it. When the door closed, she sensed resistance. Something was retreating. An invisible pull tugged at her. She fell backwards into her room when the string snapped. Bathroom doors crashed open. She imagined she would meet whatever was frightening her family. She was trapped in her bedroom when her bedroom door banged before she could see anything from the bathroom. She heard pans rustling and metal clinking outside her door. It interacted with its hallway tool pile. She noticed smoke enter her room from under the door after a moment. She went to the door and threw it open. She observed a frying pan with a burned roll of toilet paper in the hallway. Like a fuse, toilet paper was scattered along the corridor. This creature tried to burn the hallway. She was now completely survival-oriented. It now wanted to kill her, not terrify her. She used a hoodie from her room to extinguish the pan fire. She carefully crossed the corridor, tearing away the toilet paper, preparing to face this dreadful thing at any moment. She entered the living room and spotted toilet paper, paper towels, and newspapers. Her house was prepared to burn down with her inside. She hurried out the front door after navigating the maze of flammable items, searching for other fires. She sobbed on the front steps and waited for her family to come home. Jamie was screaming violently on the steps when Susan, Matt, and Marie returned. They ran inside, saw the toilet paper and burn marks, and Jamie recounted what happened. The end. That ended it. They knew to leave. They couldn't afford to move and knew it would ruin them, but they had no alternative. They packed only what they needed and left the house and its contents. House never sold. Susan went bankrupt. Strange things happened after they went. Next-door neighbors moved. The neighboring household moved. 5 nearby households pack up and leave. Not one of their homes sold. They remain empty, and no one knows why. Even though they were broke, Susan, Matt, Jamie, and Marie were glad to leave. Since leaving that house, they never experienced any paranormal activity again and are happy they survived. 911 dispatchers are prepared to handle banal and alarming calls. But Reno, Nevada dispatchers may have received the creepiest 911 calls ever. An elderly couple resided in a modest house 20 miles east of Reno. In 2010, her spouse died, leaving her alone at home. She started calling 911 twice or 3 times a week following his death. She didn't call for emergencies. She asked for things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil for my tea?" and "Could you come over and change the thermostat? It's a bit chilly." The dispatchers knew she had dementia. They always talked gently and told her 911 was for emergencies. She always seemed to understand, apologize, and hang up. These calls were confused and not emergencies, therefore first responders were never sent to her house. No matter how many times they explained it, she continued phoning. Her calls changed eventually. Instead of asking for help with routine domestic tasks, she called 911 thinking she was talking to her deceased husband, John. Dispatchers would answer the phone and hear her say, "John? Where are you? John, please come home." By now, they were so familiar with her that her address would appear up on their screen and they knew who it was. A protocol governed her calls. They answered politely and repeated their script. "Ma'am, this is 911. You can't call this number unless it's an emergency. You need to talk to your family." They didn't send a response unit again because she sounded confused, not in danger. Her tone changed when her number called one day. She sounded panicked and afraid. "John, please come home." "Help me." "I need help, John. Come home." Her worried cry prompted the dispatcher to send first responders to her house for a welfare check. A few minutes later, the responding police unit pounded loudly on her front door and called her name. No response. Complete silence filled the house. The door was unlocked when they turned the knob. After identifying themselves as police, they entered. They immediately noticed how cold the house was. It was obvious the heat was off. They checked the first level but couldn't find her. No struggle or unusual behavior was observed. They walked upstairs to examine rooms. Each room was unoccupied until the master bedroom. The elderly woman was on the bed when they opened the door. Her death was obvious. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body after death, made her look dead for hours. The officers confirmed that the woman on the bed was the house owner and 911 caller. They updated the dispatch center by calling back. They told the dispatcher, "The woman you said made that 911 call a few minutes ago, it couldn't have been her. Based on the state of the body, she was already dead at the time that call was made." But the dispatchers insisted. "No way," they said. "We know what she sounds like. We talk to her multiple times a week. We have a whole procedure for her. The call that led you to that house was made by her." It was her voice. Police and dispatchers debated the discrepancies. They reached a rational conclusion. Not real rigor mortis, they decided. Her house was frigid, making her stiff. They assumed she called 911 and died in the few minutes it took officers to arrive. It was a reasonable explanation, but everyone was a little scared. A few days later, 911 was called again. The dispatcher noticed the deceased woman's home address on the screen. Double take. It wasn't possible. They assumed a relative or friend was at the house. Blood chilled when the dispatcher answered. It was her. She screamed for her spouse in the same voice. "John, come here! Save me! Help me!" The dispatcher followed procedure and stayed calm despite knowing the whole background and that this woman was supposed to be dead. The call ended abruptly when they tried to acquire further information from her. They sent a crew to inspect the house since they had no other choice. Responding cops returned to the property. Knocked on the door. No reply. The door was unlocked from their last visit. The house was empty when they entered. Nobody there could have made that call. At this moment, the dispatch center suspected a terrible trick. The next day, it happened again. Another call from the dead woman's home. The same frantic voice begged for her spouse and for aid when they picked it up. The dispatcher tried to keep her on the line again, but it cut out. They sent officers again after a 911 plea for help. Another unoccupied house greeted the cops. As before, she received calls many times a week. Vandals broke into and burnt her empty house, but they continued. It was a burnt-out lot with no house, but 911 calls came from that location. Finally, police told the phone company about the strange scenario. The phone company examined its records and found that the woman's line was cut nearly immediately after her death. However, they told the police that the number may have been functional because the line was possibly not severed correctly at the spot. So they sent a lineman to inspect the property. The lineman checked the connections at the burned-out lot and reported that everything was correctly removed. The phone company suggested another option. Maybe a digital recording of her voice got stuck in their system and was arbitrarily sent to 911. The dispatchers rejected this idea. They stated it didn't sound like a loop. She always yelled for her husband to save her, but her voice changed. Her voice, accent, and terror level were different every time she called. As there was no clear cause, the dispatch center had to treat every call as an emergency. They got ghost calls many times a week for a year. Every time, they had to send police to check on a vacant, burned-down lot, knowing no one was there. Finally, exactly 1 year after the woman died, the calls ceased. They never got another. The calls weren't a threat, therefore the cops didn't investigate. Very strange. The official explanation for a dead woman calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent residence for a year is, we don't know. Dave Murphy was a young Salt Lake City police officer in 2006. His first job was providing physical security for government sites as a protective service officer. The Capital City Theater, a Salt Lake City institution since the early 1900s, was Dave's first assignment. Dave started working at the theater in early August. There, he met his partner, Morgan Matthews, an experienced officer. Dave later said Morgan was business from the start. Though cordial, he was frigid. Morgan escorted Dave first to the control room on the first floor of the 3-story theater. There was a vast basement below the structure. All the theater's security cameras were monitored in the control room. The cameras were ancient and low quality. At night, most lights were off, so you could only see the screen if a light was on. Morgan told Dave they had to conduct their rounds after the quick control room tour. "This is what we do at the beginning and end of every shift," he said. "We walk the entire building, make sure every door is locked and every light is off." Morgan took Dave to the basement. Dave was amazed by its size when he saw it for the first time. The lengthy hallway seemed to go on forever into the darkness. A piano sat alone in this big, empty hall. Poor lighting and musty air were down there. Dave recalls feeling creeped out immediately. The dark hallway with closed doors and the piano in the middle was disturbing. "I don't want to spend much time down here," he thought. After inspecting each door, they returned up the corridor to examine the first, second, and third floors. The rest of their shift was spent in the control room after the security round. Dave wanted to get to know his new partner, but Morgan was icy and uninterested in small talk. Dave observed Morgan seemed nearly frantic to finish the last rounds and leave the building as their shift ended. After that first night, Dave had a peculiar sense that Morgan hated the theater. It took Morgan a while to explain why he was right. Dave's training included security rounds with Morgan over the next 2 days. Morgan concluded 2 days after Dave started that Dave knew the building well enough to tackle the final rounds alone on August 9. "Morgan, why don't you take this one?" Dave felt confident and patrolled the scary basement. After locking the doors and turning out the lights, he checked the first floor's rooms, including the main auditorium. He went to the second floor to examine the rooms and balcony, then to the third floor for the staff offices. He finished his checklist with the practice room. This open doorway was the only room in the building without a door. Just pop your head in, look around, and leave. Dave went to the rehearsal room, turned on the light, and looked in. The room was vacant. Once satisfied, he turned out the light and turned back into the corridor to go when a door across the hall banged shut violently. It was the bathroom door. His first impression was that someone was fleeing the building after sheltering there. He instinctively grabbed his radio and phoned Morgan. Morgan heard someone's on the third floor, but saw no one on the hallway video. Dave had grabbed his gun and was examining the dark hallway. He didn't see runners. While waiting for Morgan to save him, he thought about two things. First, hearing the door bang didn't mean the person ran out. They may still be in the bathroom. Second, he remembered from his training that the bathroom door had a heavy-duty hydraulic hinge. That door could not close. He was aiming his revolver at the bathroom door when Morgan emerged at the top of the stairs with his weapon. They entered the bathroom and cleared every stall and corner. No one was there. There was no escape. Okay, they thought, they must have run out of the bathroom before slamming the door. They're somewhere else in the theater. They searched the entire building. They left the bathroom with pistols drawn and checked all third-floor doors. All was locked. Dave could see via the stairway door window that the second-floor lights were on as they descended. He recalled turning them off minutes earlier. "Did you turn on the second-floor lights?" Morgan shook his head. No. They assumed the bathroom occupant ran to the second level and turned them on. When they entered the second story, all the lights were on and every door was open. They searched every room, closet, and crevice. Nobody was there. They switched out all lights, locked all doors, and kept searching. Lights off, doors locked, the first floor was perfect. They descended to the basement. As they searched for an intruder, the creepiness increased. They searched every room, but found no one. Back in the control room, they reviewed third-floor surveillance footage. The camera wasn't pointed toward the restroom door, and the corridor was too dark to view. The footage only shows the practice room light flashing on and off and the door slamming loudly. They couldn't explain. They were afraid that someone was still in the building. One more thorough search yielded nothing. They gave up and left, calling it a bizarre, unexplained experience. Morgan worked alone on August 11th, 2 days later. Off day for Dave. Morgan perceived whispers from the hallway behind him while in the control room. After the door slammed, he was hypervigilant. He exited the hallway with his pistol. After he did, the whispering sound moved down the hall away from him. Nothing was visible when he peered around. He slowly walked down the corridor to the basement stairway. As he climbed the steps, he heard someone coughing from the basement. Morgan now acknowledged to being afraid. After all the strange things that had been happening, being alone in this vast, ancient theater and hearing coughing from the spooky basement was unnerving. He slowly descended the stairs with his rifle pointing ahead. He stopped coughing as he turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs. He turned on the lights and saw a long, deserted hallway. There was nothing. He checked all the doors as he walked down the corridor. Farther down the cellar, he smelled smoke. It came from a locked door next to him. He entered expecting a fire after unlocking the door. Despite the strong smoke scent, the room was empty and there was no fire. He examined the little room with the light on, but found nothing. He searched every room in the basement, convinced there was a fire. There was nothing. The smoke smell vanished as quickly as it appeared. He searched the auditorium for fires, but found none. He pondered phoning the fire department, but what would he say? He had to assume he smelled something. A few weeks later, on September 4, Dave arrived early for his shift at the theater. He spotted 3 employees speaking at the front desk when he entered. He overheard one talking about theater spirits as he passed. He was immediately intrigued. He approached the chatting man and introduced himself. Blair Fuller was the theater's senior accountant. Dave asked, "What's this about ghosts?" "I'm a security officer here, and I've seen some strange things myself." Blair invited Dave to his third-floor office to explain. "Okay," Blair said, "I've got a story for you. This happened a couple of years ago. I was right here in this office working late. It was about 9 or 10 at night, and I heard the elevator kick on. A loud elevator engine was always visible outside Blair's office. He didn't think much of it until he realized he was the only one in the building. The lights above the elevator door indicated the floor from his office window. It rose from the basement. It halted on the 3rd floor after the first 2. No one was there when the doors opened. Blair claimed he wasn't worried. He thought there was scheduled maintenance. The elevator alarm, which sounds when something blocks the entrance, went off after a while. He heard the loud ringing from his window, but saw nothing in the entryway. From his office, he walked to the elevator. He reported the temperature plummeted when he entered. The elevator was cold. He turned to face his office, and the doors closed. He said he didn't get off. It was his choice to ride. The elevator went down when the basement button lit up, obviously pressed. He wondered, what in the world is going on? The basement elevator opens. The place is empty. He entered the eerie underground hall. He shouted, "Hey, is anyone down here?" with all his courage. No one responded. Only light came from the open elevator car. He scarcely saw the piano in the hall. He looked both ways. Nothing. He was so scared that he climbed back in the elevator and repeatedly punched the 3rd floor and door close buttons. He ascended after the doors closed. He returned to his office, closed the door, and sat, heart thumping. While trying to understand what happened, he heard a tremendous banging sound outside his office. His door opened, and he peered out. His eyes fell on a large metal filing cabinet in the entrance with all its drawers open. That was not his doing. He watched as the hefty drawers closed themselves one by one. Bang, 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 until they all closed. He tried opening a drawer to test whether it would close itself, but it didn't. Something must have closed it. He then left with his belongings. He never worked another theater night shift. Dave informed Morgan of Blair's remarks later that night. Morgan surprised him by opening up. He said, "You know, even before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched in this building. And then we had that experience with the slamming door and the lights. And just a few days ago, when I was here alone, I heard voices and someone coughing in the basement, and I smelled smoke. They were finally open about how uncomfortable they felt." Dave thought of it. "My best friend, Greg, said, I'll invite him over one night. We'll tell him we're just giving him a tour, and we won't say anything about the strange stuff. We'll just see if he notices anything. If something happens, we'll have another witness to validate it." Morgan agreed with him. The next day, Dave's friend Greg came for his tour. They started in the main auditorium and went to the basement. Morgan and Dave observed an open door down the long corridor when Morgan turned on the light at the top of the stairs. They were certain that door should be locked. They pulled Greg behind them, drew their pistols, and moved down the hall to the door. The door banged in front of them as they left. 3 shocked people stared at each other. Before they could act, the doorknob rattled fiercely. A few seconds later, the rattling ceased. Dave and Morgan understood they had to enter. Greg followed them since he was afraid in the hall alone. They entered the little room with pistols drawn, but found no one. Greg exclaimed and pointed to a corner. He murmured, "Someone's sitting in the corner." After turning around, Dave and Morgan aimed their weapons at the corner, but saw nothing. "I just saw someone," Greg said. One of them said, "He was wearing a hood, like a sweatshirt." He was right there. Greg was seeing things after they brought him in to disprove the oddity. They left, locked, and headed upstairs swiftly. "I'm out of here," Greg remarked, leaving. All the weird episodes were reported, but Dave and Morgan framed them as break-ins, not hauntings. The county installed a new theater security camera system with infrared night vision. Morgan worked alone on September 15th to install the new cameras. He was in the control room testing the new equipment and seeing camera feed. An image on a television drew his attention. Main auditorium camera. The zoomed-out camera made it hard to discern if someone was sitting in a seat. He zoomed in and saw a guy seated with a hood. Morgan saw bright eyes staring at the camera as the person slowly moved its head. The figure suddenly rose, drifting toward the ceiling, disappearing. Morgan finished. He didn't probe. He didn't request assistance. He packed up, left the theater, and quit his job that day. A few weeks later, Dave worked alone at the theater. He heard a piano playing suddenly in the control room. Basement piano was the sole piano in the building. He pulled his gun and exited the control room because he had to investigate. As he approached the basement stairs, the piano music increased. As he downed the stairs, he heard the piano key's wooden cover close and the music stop just before he turned the corner into the long hallway. He turned the corner, turned on the lights, and surveyed the hall. Nobody was there. He realized he would never find anyone. Whatever haunted the theater. That satisfied Dave. He returned upstairs, locked himself in the control room until his shift ended, and left. The next day, he told his sergeant, "You can never assign me to that theater again, or I will quit." He was reassigned immediately. No full-time security officer worked at the theater for 2 months. The role was finally filled by veteran police officer Josh Thomas on November 26th. Dave drove near the theater on his first night of duty. Josh's voice suddenly rang out over the radio. "I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater." Dave already suspected otherwise. He didn't want to return, but he had to warn the new guy. Josh was standing outside a rear door, terrified, when Dave came. Josh said he heard voices in the basement while making rounds. On the third story, he observed the elevator rise from the basement by itself. It was vacant when the doors opened. When the door alarm went off unexpectedly, he called for help. Dave said, "Look, let's just search the building together." They searched the theater, but discovered nothing. Before Dave left, they were conversing on the big auditorium stage. Josh faced Dave when his back was to the audience. Josh paused, mid-sentence, transfixed, and stared at something above Dave's shoulder. "What?" asked Dave. Josh murmured, "There's something behind you." Dave carefully turned. A man stood in the dark theater's rear. He was hooded and faced away. The figure turned rapidly and faced them. Deep, dark, sunken eyes and a black, scorched face suggested it had been terribly burned. The stranger glanced at them before turning and rushing out of the theater's rear. Josh thought it was an intruder, but Dave knew better. They checked the building again, but discovered no shrouded figure. Dave sat Josh down in the control room and told him everything, his, Morgan's, and Blair's. Dave later researched the theater's history. His research revealed a devastating 1940s fire in the structure. A man trapped in the basement died in the fire. Dave, Morgan, and Josh believed they were seeing the ghost of that man still haunting his grave. 6 DeFeo family members were asleep in their beds in calm suburban Amityville, New York on the 13th of November, 1974. The 7th family member, 23-year-old Ron DeFeo Jr., was awake in his basement room. He got out of bed at 1 a.m., grabbed a powerful gun, and climbed the stairs. He reached the second-floor landing after climbing the second flight of steps. He went straight to his parents' bedroom. A little candle on his father's bedside table illuminated the room. Ron shot his father twice in the back with the rifle. After his father stopped, he shot his mother twice with the rifle. He left the room calmly and crossed the hall to his two younger brothers' bedroom. He fired one shot at his 2-year-old brother Mark with the weapon again. He then fired one shot at his 9-year-old brother John. His 3-year-old sister Allison was asleep in another bedroom down the hall when he exited their room. He shot once with the rifle. After leaving her room, he went up a third set of stairs to the third story, located his 8-year-old sister Dawn, and shot her one last time. Ron DeFeo Jr. killed his family in 15 minutes. He was calm and collected. He casually moved from room to room, taking well-aimed shots. He dropped the firearm, stepped outside, and sprinted to a neighboring pub. He raced inside and yelled that he had just returned home to discover his family shot and needed help. He refused to enter the house when bar patrons followed him. They entered and saw the horror. Ron immediately confessed, "I killed my family," to the police. Ron Jr. was the most notoriously dysfunctional DeFeo. His explosive, angry temper and extensive drug and alcohol usage were well known. People avoided him. Amityville was unsurprised when Ron was found guilty of murdering the entire family. As crime scene details emerged, folks wondered if there was more to the story. All 6 victims were found face down in their beds. None exhibited evidence of fighting their attacker. Investigators initially thought Ron drugged them before killing them. No family members had narcotics or sedatives in their systems when toxicology findings came back. This didn't bother police at first. They assumed the family in the other rooms didn't hear the gunshots. Ron utilized a .35 caliber Marlin, one of the loudest guns available. Investigators tested the identical gun inside a house and found that it could be heard from a mile away. The detectives concluded that the family heard the gunshots, which was alarming. What was happening must have been known. None got out of bed for some reason. They didn't flee, hide, or fight. All they did was wait in bed. Ron's confession was odd. He informed authorities that he heard a voice in his head while lying in his basement bed, unable to sleep the night of the murders. The voice said, "Kill them." He believed he was going crazy. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness under the basement stairs and approached him. Ron saw this creature stroll up to his bed, bend down, and whisper, "Kill them." He said he lost control of his body at that point. Involuntarily, he grabbed the gun next to his bed, rose up, and headed upstairs. He knew he was going to kill his family and didn't want to, but he had no choice. He claimed to be possessed by a basement demon. Ron's tale horrified Amityville, but a demon-possessed mansion didn't hold up in court. His 6 murder convictions earned him life in jail. The Lutz family moved into the notorious mansion a year later. After 28 days, they fled in terror, claiming supernatural forces were tormenting them, including cellar voices. After then, famous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated the property. They swiftly confirmed the house was haunted. The Amityville house is one of the most haunted in the world. Lorraine captured a famous photo while the Warrens investigated. She was taking infrared photos on the 2nd floor near the bedroom where the 2 boys were killed. She and her husband Ed were alone in the house. One photo of the processed film showed a young boy with luminous eyes peering out of a doorway. Lorraine has long maintained the boy in the picture is 9-year-old John DeFeo's ghost. The house still stands in Amityville and has been sold many times. No one seems to like living there long. Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. Tonight, I have 2 great stories, but I couldn't figure out how to tease them like I do at the top of these episodes. I realized that what makes these stories special is that they're both great campfire stories. Two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly lived in a quiet, rural New York in the late 1990s. Best friends, they were inseparable and part of a large high school group that spent a lot of time together. Still, Rachel and Molly had a special bond within that larger circle. Two of them were often seen together, sharing secrets and navigating high school. Love of goth culture brought them together and bonded their group. High school goths had a distinct identity in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It meant wearing mostly black. Black nail polish, lipstick, and a deep black hair coloring. Celebrate all things dark and macabre. Others saw it as a philosophical exploration of life's darker side and a way to express their non-mainstream feelings. Many saw it as a fashion statement, a way to stand out and feel special. It was a distinct subculture in the late 1990s, and Rachel and Molly were fully committed to it. They liked the music, fashion, and atmosphere. A favorite hangout for Rachel, Molly, and their goth friends was the local cemetery. It was initially a joke, an ironic performance of their identity. Where else would the goth kids hang out than a cemetery? Their first few trips there were humorous because it felt too predictable. Odd thing happened. The cemetery was actually cool to hang out in. They were never bothered there in the peace. So it became their seat. It was their weekend hangout. The cemetery was usually visited at night by Rachel, Molly, and their friends. This maximized the dark, spooky atmosphere they were going for, leaning goth. A more important rule was that they always went together. Rachel and Molly were never alone. They always hung out with several of their friends. This had several causes. First, more people meant more energy and conversation, making it more fun. Though they loved it, the cemetery was creepy at night. Numbers provided safety. It felt less intimidating and more like their own park with a group. Rachel was home alone on a Friday night, bored, when the phone rang. Was Molly. Caller Molly was cheerful. Rachel replied immediately when she asked, "Hey, you want to go hang out in the cemetery?" "Duh," she said. They did it on weekends. "I'd love to go." "Come pick me up." Rachel got ready after saying goodbye. It was her usual all-black outfit, makeup, and waiting outside for Molly's car. A few minutes later, Molly's headlights turned onto her street, and the car pulled up to the curb. Rachel saw Molly alone in the car first. It was odd. When they picked her up for cemetery nights, the car was usually full of friends. Rachel entered through the passenger door. While buckling her seatbelt, she asked Molly, "Hey, so where is everyone? Are we going to pick up the rest of the group now?" Molly dismissed her. "In fact, no," she said. "I tried calling everyone else, but they're all busy. Some are working, some are hungover from last night. It's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Is that okay?" Rachel had an uneasy feeling. Really, this was wrong. They did not do this. The cemetery hangout was about group dynamics and shared experience. Just one person made me feel more vulnerable. There was no problem with her closeness to Molly. Being in that big, dark cemetery without their friends made them uncomfortable. She looked over at Molly, who seemed to have accepted it. Rachel didn't want to be negative or crude. It seemed impossible to say no now. So she smiled and said, "Oh yeah, that's fine. It'll be great, just the two of us. Let's go." Despite her hesitation, she sat down and they drove the half-mile to the cemetery. The cemetery was massive. A massive, ancient burial ground stretched for miles. A massive, medieval-looking gate with a wrought iron archway spanned the entrance, greeted you as you approached. The archway made the gates look Gothic and imposing, even though they were always open. After passing that arch, a single road ran straight down the cemetery from front to back, probably over a mile. That road divided the grounds into two huge parts, the right and left. Molly, Rachel, and their friends frequented the back left corner. Terrain was their reason for choosing that area. Left of the cemetery were rolling hills where plots were laid out. That back left corner had a natural depression, a shallow bowl with few tombstones. At the bottom of this depression was a large boulder and tree. This place fit them. Standing at the main gate and scanning the vast cemetery, anyone sitting in that depressed area would be hidden. Teenagers wanted to be hidden, so they were. It was their secret hideout. So Rachel and Molly drove through the grand gate and down that long straight road to the cemetery's back. The sun had set and it was growing dark. Although it wasn't pitch black, the light was fading fast. Nobody was around, as usual. This time of night, the cemetery was usually empty. Local university students occasionally hopped the fence on the opposite side of the cemetery from them. They sometimes lit a bonfire against the fence on that side. Sometimes they sneaked over and did it, even though it was illegal. But that was unusual. Most of the cemetery was empty except for college students. They parked at the end of the road and exited. They descended the gentle grassy slope from the road into their usual gathering spot, the depression. At the bottom, they leaned back against the tree trunk on the big rock by their usual spots. They smoked cigarettes and talked as usual. Rural New York goth teens in the 1990s did this. They chatted about boyfriends, school drama, and stories. Light faded from the sky, making it completely dark. Girls still enjoyed themselves. Rachel was thinking this was kind of nice. Not as scary as she expected. It was calm and comfortable, and she was spending time with her best friend. They noticed a new smell after a while. Smoke smelled distinct. The bonfire spot across the cemetery was now remembered by both. Even though it was far away, college students could have started a fire. First, they glanced over that way and saw nothing, but they'd been hanging out for a while. While they were down there, those kids could have hopped the fence and started a fire. They weren't bothered by the fire. On the other side of the huge cemetery, it didn't affect their work. Rachel and Molly knew from past experience that the police always arrived at bonfires there. Predestined. They were kicked out after the police made the kids put out their fire. To ensure no one was around after hours, they always swept the cemetery. Even if they weren't starting fires, Molly and Rachel would be expelled. Rachel and Molly looked at each other as they smelled the smoke and agreed. Leave now before the police arrive and force them to. Additionally, they had been there for a while and were ready to leave. Their timeline accelerated slightly. It was fine. They extinguished their cigarettes, gathered their belongings, and walked back up the hill to the car. As they climbed the hill, they expected to see their car parked on the road. They hoped to see the tiny flicker of the bonfire they were smelling across the cemetery. They didn't see a fire on the cemetery's other side when they reached the hilltop. Instead, to their right, maybe 100 meters away, was another depression and rolling hill that dipped out of sight. They saw flickering flames from that direction. The fire started in the depression next to their cemetery, not across it. This was odd. This side of the cemetery was empty when they arrived. The place was empty. Someone had arrived while they were there and started a fire nearby. Never before had they seen this. It was strange. Nobody started fires here. What happened? Both girls wondered. They assumed the college students had tried a new place. They only saw the fire's tops rising from the ridgeline, not the people. The person over there probably didn't know they were here. They had an idea. Molly asked Rachel, "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill? We could poke our heads over and see who it is. We could spy on them." An exciting, slightly mischievous idea. Why not since they were here? Two girls agreed, turned around, and returned to depression. They climbed the hill opposite the mysterious fire, past the big rock and tree where they had been sitting for 2 hours. They moved quietly to hide. Rachel accidentally made noise as they approached the hilltop, where they could see the fire and whoever was there. In the quiet night, she stepped on a dry branch or loose rock, which cracked loudly. Fire crackling was the only sound. No one spoke from the other side. Rachel covered her mouth and stared at Molly. Molly asked, "What are you doing?" We're trying to be quiet. Twin girls froze. They stood still, listening to see if the firemen heard them. It was silent. A spooky silence. The mood changed then. Something was off. Even though they hadn't reached the top of the hill or seen who was at the fire, their playful curiosity had turned into a cold dread. Both looked at each other and knew they were thinking the same thing. They agreed, maybe we should just turn around and leave. Yeah, let's get out of here. This doesn't feel right. As quietly as possible, the two girls turned around and returned to their depression. They quickly passed the rock and tree and returned up the hill to their car. Rachel glanced back over her shoulder at the hill they had just come from while walking. And what she saw chilled her. Man stood on ridgeline. The fire behind him silhouetted him, making him ominous against the orange glow. Standing still, he stared at them. Though silent, he watched them. It was him at the fire. The Rachel noise must have reached him. Molly turned and saw the man as Rachel frantically whispered, "Molly, look, look." She felt pure fear. "Let's get out of here," she panicked. "We don't know who that guy is." "We have to go now." They stopped, ran up the hill. Seconds later, Rachel glanced back. The hillman was gone. She thought he was gone, terrified. Then she saw movement in the darkness below. He ran down the hill toward them. Girl screamed. The grassy slope to the road was scrambled at full speed. The man was closing in, and Rachel kept looking back. He moved quickly. They ran to Molly's car after climbing the hill, their lungs burning. They fiddled with the doors, jumped inside, and slammed them shut, locking them. Molly started the engine, jumped out, and screeched tires on the asphalt. Rachel watched out the back window as they drove down the cemetery road. She saw him. Reaching the road, he was almost there. He paused as their car vanished into the night. After turning, he slowly descended the hill out of sight. Molly and Rachel were traumatized. Their hearts raced and they panted. That was no college student. That was a grown man, possibly in his 40s, unfamiliar to them. Everything felt creepy and dangerous. It baffled them. They kept asking, what would have happened if he caught us? What was he trying to do? What just happened? By the time Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the terror had subsided and been replaced by cautious energy. They nearly laughed it off as a crazy night. Man, that was insane, huh? They told a wild story about a close call. They promised not to return alone at night. Rachel entered home. Never told her mom what happened. She put her things down, went to her room, and calmed down. Without telling anyone about their terrifying encounter, Molly did the same at home. They both went to bed to forget. The next morning, Rachel went downstairs to the kitchen. Mom was making coffee and going through her morning routine. She asked, "Hey, how was your night last night?" Rachel shrugged. "Oh, it was fine. Me and Molly went out." "No big deal." Her mother looked serious. Ripped her head. "Oh, did you hear what happened last night?" Her mother asked gravely. "No, what do you mean?" "What happened?" "Well, a woman in our town got kidnapped. She was taken from the parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me." Rachel's wide eyes. The mother of Rachel breathed deeply. "No. I mean, yes, they found her. But unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night. And they burned her in a huge bonfire." Her mom let the words sink in. "Whoever did it still hasn't been caught." Hearing this felt like the floor fell out from under Rachel. Her world fell apart. Now, everything from the night before made sense sickeningly. They smelled no college party bonfire. Mom mentioned that fire. A man chased them and was the killer. The murdered woman's body was likely in that fire. They were just 100 meters from a killer dumping his victim's body. Scary thought. They likely witnessed the killer set the fire and start this horrific act. What if that man caught them? Were they to continue spying on him over the hill without Rachel's noise, what would he have done to them? Rachel broke down and told her mom everything from the night before. Horror struck her mother. Rachel called Molly immediately to tell her what she had learned. Caller Molly went hysterical. They realized how close they were to disaster. They presented their case to the police. They best described the man, but it wasn't much. They feared the dark. All they knew was that he was average-sized and probably in his 40s. It wasn't specific. Fortunately, police caught the killer 48 hours later. Not because of the girl's description, but luck. Police saw the victim's car driving around town. Car stopped, and the driver was the killer. After arrest, he confessed. Not surprisingly, Rachel and Molly never saw that cemetery the same. They feel lucky when they think about that night. Rachel's accidental noise as they approached the fire may have saved them. One accidental sound made them pause, reconsider, and turn around to leave. That saved them because if they had crested that hill and met the killer, they may have both died in that bonfire. I served in the military before starting this channel and telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. 7 years as Navy SEAL. I thought that was my life's purpose and career. Getting hurt made it not the right fit for me in the long run. The rest is history after I left the service. My military experience includes many funny stories about our brutal training and some scary stories about my overseas service. Experiencing my first deployment to Afghanistan has always stood out to me as a special memory. That it's not a war story helps it stand out. The Navy SEAL training took almost 3 years of my life. An arduous process. I finally arrived. SEAL Team 2 in Virginia was my East Coast assignment. We immediately started training for our first deployment and learned we were going to Afghanistan. This was in 2013, when going to Afghanistan meant fighting. There were active combat operations nationwide. Navy SEALs and other direct combat units want war. You've spent years training for it, not because you're a warmonger or love violence. You want to prove yourself and do your best after all your hard work. Thus, I was preparing for battle. It was deployment day. In a typical SEALs flight, the team isn't sent out together. It's unsafe. That plane crash could kill a platoon. You're sent out in small batches, sometimes on civilian flights for the first leg. I flew to South America with 2 other SEALs dressed as civilians. From there, we took a military transit flight into Afghanistan. I was focused throughout. The end. I've prepared for this. Here goes. The last leg of the trip, the flight into Afghanistan, was on that military plane. The military pilots made 2 changes when we entered active war zone Afghan airspace. A dark red replaced the aircraft's white overhead lights. They then told us to avoid windows over the intercom. We were approaching the most dangerous part of the flight, landing. You didn't want to sit next to a window if the plane was shot at from the ground. It wouldn't matter where you were sitting if the plane was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, but it was a stark reminder that we were about to enter a war zone. Also intense was landing these large transport planes in combat zones. They needed to minimize ground-level small arms fire at them. Lower people are more vulnerable. They would land combatively. They would dive straight down toward the runway and pull up at the last second to land abruptly. It was rough. We were on this crazy landing, red lights glowing, everyone tucked away from the windows, and my mind kept repeating, "Okay, we're ready for Afghanistan." Fob Shank is a well-fortified base where we landed safely. The massive ramp at the back of the plane lowered after taxiing. Since my gear had been shipped on pallets weeks earlier, I grabbed my pack. I had only my backpack. I and a teammate walked down the ramp onto the tarmac. We existed. First sighting of Afghanistan. I didn't see the country the first time because the plane windows were tiny portholes and we were told to avoid them. Honestly, standing there and looking around was breathtaking. Afghanistan's beauty is astounding. These massive snow-covered mountains and beautiful wide-open fields surrounded us 360 degrees. The land appeared unspoiled. The jagged scar on the earth was the NATO base, where war was launched. Contrast was striking. I didn't understand. This place was too beautiful to fight. That feeling did not last. We were quickly led to a holding area, grabbed our gear, and loaded into MRAPs or heavily armored military vehicles. These are IED-resistant 50-ton beasts. We drove from that big base to a smaller, more remote, forward-operating base in the sticks. It was more vulnerable, and we would operate there for 6 months. Our new home arrived late that night. This primitive outpost was in the middle of nowhere. When we arrived, the SEAL team we were replacing was finishing their deployment. There were interpreters who are crucial to the war effort. These interpreters were mostly 20-somethings who had worked on these bases with American units for years. They couldn't leave the base because they worked with NATO. As traitors, the Taliban and other militant groups targeted them. These interpreters believed that working with NATO would allow them to leave Afghanistan and immigrate to the US. Some fulfilled that promise. And these guys were tough. They fought more than most soldiers. They witnessed some incredible events. I met our partner force and interpreters right away because my platoon role involved working closely with them. SEAL Team 8, already there, was crazy. There had been 6 months of fighting. These huge men with massive beards seemed unconcerned about everything. My first night, I was super green. I met with one of our interpreters to learn the scope and expectations. We discussed possible operations and got to know each other. This 25 or 26-year-old interpreter leaned in and said, "Bro, bro," and they all used American slang they picked up from being around young soldiers and Marines all day. He asked, "Bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? We were in a different province." I soon learned that local interpreters and soldiers had a persistent, almost legendary story about a giant, big humanoid creature that lived in a cave in Kandahar's mountains. Afghanistan has endless mountains and caves. Humans have probably never explored many of these caves in remote areas. Indeed, this interpreter was serious. He declared, "Bro, I'm telling you, it's real. There was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Have you heard about this?" He seemed curious and wanted to know more. It planted a seed in my mind without further discussion that night. This interpreter, who had seen real combat and was not prone to fantasy, believed this weird story. The idea stuck. Many years later, I'm out of the military and writing strange, dark, and mysterious stories online. At the start of the channel, I was thinking about what stories to tell, and remembered the Kandahar giant. It seemed like a good idea to investigate what my interpreter was saying. I found this treasure trove of testimony from a specific group of Green Berets, a special forces team that had a very real and very strange encounter in Kandahar caves. One soldier, anonymously known as Mr. K, due to fear of repercussions for speaking out, gave shocking testimony about what they saw. I wanted to compile all the notes and tell my interpreter's story from years ago. I'll repeat that story tonight. An Army infantry unit patrolled Kandahar in 2002. Imagine huge, snow-covered peaks and deep valleys. In 2002, these patrols searched for Taliban hideouts and cave systems or enemy fighters in valleys below. These patrols were routine. Soldiers, regardless of branch, update their superiors while on patrol. Routine or not, most operations are planned. Everything is planned: when you arrive, how long you'll stay, your goals, when you leave, and how you'll leave. It's organized. This infantry unit patrolled routinely. However, their higher command lost contact with them mid-mission. A red flag was raised immediately. A unit's communications were sometimes lost. It's hard to send radio signals across huge mountain ranges with imperfect equipment. Usually, lost communications are recovered quickly. A long time passed without this unit's response. As the higher command debated whether to send a quick reaction force or air assets to find them, something even more alarming was noted. The unit went silent without calling a tick first. A tick troops in contact indicates a gunfight. This step is crucial. If you're shot, your command doesn't know. Call it in. A support system activates when you do. Air support, medical evacuation, and reinforcements may be needed. Someone on the ground yells tick, tick, tick into the radio when a firefight begins. Everyone is on alert to help. Soldiers call in ticks too quickly because they're like cheat codes for overwhelming support. An engagement of this magnitude rarely goes unreported. To have an entire unit go silent without calling in a tick was strange. It meant it was either a massive, unprecedented radio failure or something else that didn't fit combat patterns. After a while, the Army decided to send an elite unit to find the unit. The mission was given to the Army's top special forces, the Green Berets. Mr. K was in that Green Beret detachment. Mr. K's small team of Green Berets took helicopters to the remote Kandahar area where the infantry unit was last seen. The landing was as rural as it gets. Only the occasional mud hut existed. That mountain range was vast and empty. It can feel like another planet. There was nothing to see. All around was a wasteland, no locals or Americans. People knew the search area was huge and the terrain was rough. Hiking through the mountains to find the missing soldiers would be difficult for several days. Each carried a heavy pack of ammo, water, and gear. They hiked the missing unit's rough route. Hiking through the mountains yielded nothing. For several days, they hiked all day. They had a few distant enemy encounters, but nothing major. They were searching for missing soldiers, not fighting. Hiking, they searched the landscape for clues. Days went by with no results. On their fourth day of searching, Mr. K and his team saw a goat trail ahead while walking through a mountain range. The narrow path climbed and crossed the mountain. So they took it. No intelligence led them there, but it was a trail which was easier to walk on than the rocky terrain they had been navigating. They thought they'd follow it across, get a better view, and spot something in the next valley. Therefore, Mr. K and the Green Berets started up the winding goat trail. As they walked, they saw plastic and metal fragments on the path. They were initially unidentified. While climbing, they realized these were military equipment fragments. Radios and other equipment from an American infantry unit were included. Their senses were primed. The men had rifles ready, including Mr. K. They climbed the trail more cautiously, knowing they were on the right track, but that they could face danger. On top of this mountain, what would they find? Bloody ambush grounds? Surviving unit members? Unaware. Evidence increased as they hiked. Large radios and military backpacks were found. They found uniforms with name tags and unit patches. They now knew the uniforms belonged to the unit they were looking for. They had found their first real lead, and it looked bad. They reached Trail's peak. Green Berets are the world's best trained soldiers. Regardless of how bizarre, their training would take over. They would have moved precisely and confidently, ready for anything. After climbing the trail, Mr. K and his team reached a flat plateau. 3 massive cave entrances opened up onto the plateau like front porch doors as the mountain rose above it. More military equipment was scattered on this plateau, but this time it was different. Some bones were human. Human bones were scattered. No one was here. If the missing unit were here, something terrible had happened to them. Green Berets set up defensive positions around the plateau immediately. It was imperative to clear those caves. Inside were survivors? The perpetrators were inside? To investigate, Mr. Kay and his shooting partner had to approach a cave entrance. The team supplied cover and watched all angles as they crossed the plateau silently. Mr. Kay entered with his partner. A huge opening could be walked into, but it was dark inside. It took a few steps into the cave for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Trying to spot anything, he noticed a sheer drop inside the entrance. Cave floors fell into deep pits. Though he stopped in time, he couldn't see the bottom in the darkness. As he stood up, he saw movement in the cave's back, across the deep crevasse. On instinct, Mr. Kay raised his rifle to shoot. He was stopped by a huge spear, like a javelin, flying out of the darkness. Impaling his partner, Soldier Dan, sent him flying backward out of the cave entrance. The team witnessed it. A huge humanoid creature bounded out of the cave in seconds. It was 12 feet tall, with fiery red hair and beard. It wore animal skins and had 6 fingers and toes on each hand and foot. It jumped the crevasse and stormed the plateau. The Green Berets fired upon it as it ran out, likely to attack the team. In seconds, a hail of bullets killed the massive creature. What happened was beyond anyone's comprehension, but their training kicked in again. Then they rushed to Dan to treat him after the threat was gone and the caves were empty. Too late. He left. The team faced an impossible situation. They had killed a 12-foot giant, lost a man, and hadn't found the missing unit. Team leader called higher command on radio. He responded with, "You have to come get us. I can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, and we have this combatant. You need to get out here, and you need to take this thing too." 2 helicopters soon followed. One was returning the Green Berets and Dan's body to base. Another helicopter's cargo net was huge. They carried the dead giant in the net, attached it to the helicopter's underside, and flew away. Standard procedure for Mr. Kay and his team was to return to base and debrief the mission. Your after-action report details what happened. Upon returning, something was different. They received no visitors. Just record what they saw and leave it. So did they. They recorded the giant attack. But higher command told them they couldn't include those details in their report. They were told to alter. They were told, "We can't say you fought a giant in a cave." Change the report. Despite knowing it was a lie, they rewrote the report to say they encountered a normal threat who killed Dan with small arms fire. They had to sign non-disclosure agreements to keep quiet about what they saw in the cave after submitting the false report. After that, they were told to forget. When they tried to find more information, all official reports about that operation were heavily redacted or classified. No one told Mr. Kay what happened to the missing infantry unit. It was all a black hole mystery. In 2016, 14 years have passed. Kay decided to reveal the truth. He thought it was wrong to hide what happened and how his friend Dan died. They agreed after talking to his teammates. He told his story because of that. When he did, he found other military personnel had seen the giant. At the airfield where the giant's body was brought, pilots saw a 12 to 15-foot tall creature with 6 fingers and 6 toes loaded onto a transport plane. They were told to never mention it and to remove it from their reports. Everyone who encountered this creature was sworn to secrecy, and the government tried to hide it. The story confuses me. Some part of me wants to trust Mr. Kay and others. I remember my grounded interpreter in Afghanistan believing something strange was living in those caves. Perhaps possible. You feel like anything could be hidden in those mountains in that ancient alien landscape. With an infantry unit still missing and a Green Beret who was killed in action, his team wants the truth about his death told. Government concealment seems obvious. They may be hiding something, but this story seems to have more to it. Much obliged for watching. Leave a comment on today's episode. We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes to binge from. Next time. Farewell. On the afternoon of Saturday, the 6th of February, 2010, 61-year-old Alan Lilu set up an ironing board behind the couch in the living room of a small house just outside the town of Chartres in northern France. From the kitchen, he could just make out the rich smell of beef bourguignon simmering on the stove. But Alan and the 37-year-old woman cooking the meal were not speaking to each other. The silence in the house was heavy and uncomfortable. The woman's name was Alexandra Nicola, and this house, the one they were currently in, was a house Alan had bought for her and her 10-year-old daughter. Alexandra had started out as Alan's assistant many years ago, but over time, their relationship had evolved into something much deeper, something more like a father and a daughter. Even now, years after Alexandra had stopped working for him, they remained incredibly close. And of course, Alan had literally bought her this home to ensure she and her daughter had a stable life. As a result of this close bond, Alan found himself visiting her often, helping out around the house, doing small chores, and just being a presence in her life. He also paid for her car and for their vacations. Alan could certainly afford to be this generous. He was a very successful, high-powered producer of circus shows, which were a surprisingly huge business in France. Many large companies would book entire circus shows for their end-of-the-year parties for employees, and Alan had managed to secure many major lucrative contracts. His business was so successful that his main office was located in a fancy chateau in the countryside. His wife, Elizabeth, lived in a separate home, a luxury ski town near the Swiss border. Alan himself was constantly on the move, traveling all over Europe for his work. But this fast-paced life could also be a real grind. In just the past 24 hours, Alan had driven more than 1,200 miles, racing between meetings with potential clients and scouting for new circus performers. So he placed a lot of value on the quiet time he could spend at Alexandra's house. It was his escape, a place where he could recharge in the peaceful suburbs and, more importantly, spend time with someone he cared a great deal about. Now, Alan wasn't naive. He knew that his friends and his coworkers all assumed he and Alexandra were having an affair. He was almost certain that's what his own wife, Elizabeth, believed as well. And to be fair, their assumptions weren't entirely baseless. Alan was known to have plenty of extramarital relationships. He also frequently engaged with sex workers and made very little effort to hide any of it from anyone. He and his wife lived completely separate lives, and they seemed to have a silent understanding. She had her life of luxury in the mountains, and he had his freedom to do as he pleased. But Alan's relationship with Alexandra was genuinely different. It had always been platonic. They had never so much as kissed or even held hands. Alan had no children of his own, and he truly enjoyed playing the role of a father figure to Alexandra and a grandfather figure to her young daughter. But right now, they were in the middle of a big fight, and Alan was anxious to fix it. Alexandra's daughter was away for the weekend, staying with friends. So he and Alexandra had planned to have a nice, quiet dinner together this evening before Alan had to get back on the road for another business trip on Sunday afternoon. But Alan, in a moment he now deeply regretted, had somewhat stupidly brought up Alexandra's past. And what started as a simple conversation had quickly escalated into a horrible fight. They had been yelling at each other on and off ever since. Alexandra was intensely defensive about her troubled history. When she was a young woman, she had moved to Paris full of dreams. She had fallen in love and had a baby, but the baby had tragically died. Her relationship fell apart soon after, and she had spiraled into a period of very self-destructive behavior. By the time Alan first met her back in 2002, which was 8 years before this argument in the little house, Alexandra was at a very low point. She had a 2-year-old daughter by then and was struggling immensely to provide for her. She was working a patchwork of minimum wage jobs and small side hustles, barely making ends meet. So when Alan had offered her a job as his full-time secretary, it had completely transformed her life. It gave her stability and a future. But deep down, there was a part of her that seemed to resent Alan's power over her more than she was grateful for his help. It was like he had total control over her well-being, her home, her car, her entire life. And she didn't always like that feeling of dependency. And so, with all that weighing on his mind, Alan left the ironing board and walked into the kitchen. He was hoping that Alexandra had cooled down enough that they could finally have a real, calm conversation. Once he was in the kitchen, he glanced over at Alexandra, who was stirring the pot on the stove, her back to him. He couldn't quite read her mood. He turned, opened the refrigerator door, and just stared inside, not really looking for anything to eat or drink. He was just biding his time, hoping she would be the first one to speak. To his immense relief, Alexandra did turn around. She playfully swung a dish towel at his arm, telling him he had to wait for dinner. She didn't seem mad anymore. Alan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He smiled and closed the fridge door. He then suggested she come sit with him and have some wine while they waited for the last load of laundry to dry so he could finish the ironing for her. A few minutes later, they were both sitting on the sofa, each with a glass of red wine. Alexandra asked Alan how his business was going. He told her it was good, which was technically true. His company was on track to bring in around $4 million that year, which is about $5 million today. But despite how things looked on paper, Alan was feeling a lot of stress. He made the vast majority of his money through those big corporate contracts. But he wasn't the only one in the game. His number one competitor was another circus owner named Michel de la Rue. And recently, Michel had been outbidding Alan on one contract after another. It was starting to feel personal, like Michel was specifically targeting Alan's existing clients, trying to steal them away from him, rather than trying to cultivate his own business. Alan explained to Alexandra that on Monday, he had a very important meeting in Vichy, a city in central France, which was about a 4-hour drive south of her house. At this meeting, Alan was hoping to land a huge contract, a real game changer for the year, as long as Michel didn't swoop in and steal it out from under him again. Alexandra gently put her hand on Alan's arm and told him not to worry. She said she was sure his meeting on Monday would be a huge success. She suggested they could celebrate in a few weeks on the ski trip he had booked for the two of them and her daughter. Then she put down her now empty wine glass and went to take care of the laundry. As Alexandra disappeared into the back of the house, Alan sat by himself for a moment, just thinking. He was really looking forward to that vacation she had mentioned. In part, it was because Alexandra had been a lot busier lately. She had a new boyfriend, a 42-year-old IT engineer from Paris named Yves Bernard. Alan and Yves got along just fine, but he could tell that things were getting pretty serious between Alexandra and Yves. They might even get married. And Alan couldn't help but worry that if that happened, Yves might eventually start to resent him for his role in Alexandra's life. He worried that Yves might see him as an overbearing figure who was a little too involved. But he decided he wasn't going to let that fear ruin the evening. As Alexandra came back into the living room with a basket of laundry, Alan picked up a book from the coffee table and took the last sip of his wine. The rest of the weekend passed by quickly, and by Sunday afternoon, Alan was back in his car, packed and ready, heading out of town for his big meeting. But what no one would realize until much, much later was that there was a second car following closely behind him. The following day, on the morning of Monday, February 8th, Alan Lilu's wife, Elizabeth, was drinking a cup of coffee inside her home in the mountains when her phone rang. She picked it up and heard the voice of Alan's longtime assistant, Sylvie. And Sylvie sounded very worried. She was calling to see if Elizabeth had heard from her husband recently. This was a strange call to receive. Alan was a creature of habit when it came to his work. He was not the type of person to just disappear and not tell his secretary where he was going. So Elizabeth told Sylvie that no, she hadn't heard from Alan in a few days. Then she asked Sylvie what was going on. And as Elizabeth listened to Sylvie's explanation, she felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Apparently, Alan had that very important meeting in Vichy that morning, but he had never shown up for it. In fact, he'd never even checked into the hotel in Vichy where he had a reservation for the night before. Sylvie said she had already tried reaching out to several of Alan's friends and business contacts, but nobody had heard from him. And he wasn't answering the repeated calls she was making to both of his cell phones, which both appeared to be turned off. None of this made any sense to Elizabeth. Alan was famous for spending entire days glued to his phones. He was always in communication with someone. She couldn't even recall a single time when he'd been unreachable, even for a few minutes. So, Elizabeth told Sylvie she was glad she had called, but that she would take over from here. Then, Elizabeth hung up the phone with Sylvie and immediately called the police to report her husband missing. A week and a half later, on February 19th, a young police officer knocked on the front door of a little house outside the town of Chartres. Up until this point, Alan's case had been treated as a simple missing persons case. The local police in Alan's wife's hometown were handling the initial inquiry, which was pretty basic. They had made a few phone calls and filed the standard reports. But now, enough time had passed without any sign of Alan and with no new evidence coming in. The original report had been escalated to the Criminal Investigation Division. They were now considering the possibility that this could be a kidnapping or something even worse. This young officer was now standing at this particular house because it was the last place Alan was known to have been before he vanished. The door of the home opened, and a thin, blonde woman looked out at him. The officer asked her if her name was Alexandra Nicola, and she confirmed that it was. When he explained to her that he was there as part of the investigation into Alan Lilu's disappearance, Alexandra's face immediately clouded with concern, and she invited him inside. As she led him into her living room and offered him a seat on her couch, the officer looked around, taking a mental inventory of the space. The house was clean, but a bit cluttered with toys that obviously belonged to a young girl, scattered here and there. The officer scanned the room for any signs of a physical struggle or any kind of violence, things like damage to the walls or overturned furniture, but there was nothing that stood out. Nothing seemed out of place or concerning. Alexandra started asking the officer a series of anxious questions about what was going on with Alan. Was he hurt? Was he in some kind of danger? What did the police know? But the young officer just shook his head and explained that for now, they really didn't know much at all. He was just there to try to build a clear timeline of Alan's last known movements. And so, speaking of that, he asked Alexandra to please walk him through what she remembered about her last interaction with Alan. The officer took careful notes as Alexandra began to recount all the details she could recall. She explained that Alan was like a surrogate father to her and that he had come over on the evening of Friday, February 5th. He had stayed with her on Friday, all day Saturday, and then had left on Sunday afternoon. He had to get on the road to drive to Vichy for his big meeting on Monday morning. She told the officer that after he left for that meeting, she hadn't heard from him, but she said that was pretty typical for them. She stressed that their relationship was not romantic in any way. It was truly platonic, and he didn't always check in with her the way a spouse or a romantic partner would. It was more like they were just really close friends. The officer nodded as he wrote down everything she said. Alexandra seemed very helpful and genuinely worried, but he was still suspicious of the idea that she and Alan were not romantically involved. It just seemed unlikely given the circumstances. So, before he left, he asked if he could see the rest of her house. He was doing this in part just to gauge her reaction. If she said no or got defensive, he would know to probe a bit more deeply. But she immediately agreed without any hesitation. And she gave him a full tour, taking him all around the house and showing him any room he wanted to see. What he found was that the rest of the house seemed just as normal and unremarkable as the living room and the entryway. She eventually brought the officer back to the front door and promised him that she would call immediately if Alan reached out to her. And so, after leaving Alexandra's house, the officer, wanting to be thorough, went door to door up and down Alexandra's street. He asked her neighbors what they remembered about that particular weekend, trying to see if anything they said contradicted Alexandra's story. But everyone he spoke to more or less confirmed what she had told him. Alan was indeed a regular visitor in the neighborhood, and several people did remember seeing him on the weekend in question. They all said that nothing had seemed off or unusual at all. So, eventually, the officer left and went back to the station. When he got there, he wrote up his report highlighting Alan's last known destination of Vichy. Over the next week, police in Vichy, as well as in the ski town where Alan's wife lived, continued to follow up on the loose threads of the investigation. They pored over Allen's cell phone history and his bank account and credit card transactions. Everything showed no activity at all after he left Alexandra's house on February 7th. They also spoke to his business connections and all of his friends, but no one had heard anything. They even put in an official request to the car company, Audi, for the GPS data that was stored in Allen's car, which was a large Audi Q7 SUV. The investigators knew it was entirely possible that Allen had chosen to disappear. He was very wealthy, he had lots of connections all over Europe. It was a possibility that he had simply decided to walk away from his life. And if that was the case, it would be incredibly difficult to find him. However, it was a lot harder to hide a car that logged all of its travel data. And so whether Allen's disappearance was voluntary, an accident, or the result of foul play, the police knew that finding his Audi was likely the best hope they had of knowing where to even begin looking for Allen. On the 26th of February 2010, 19 days since Allen had been reported missing, a detective named Pierre Martin stood in a secure impound lot in the city of Orléans, France, looking at Allen's gray Audi Q7. The GPS data that the police had requested from Audi had finally come back a few days earlier, and it had led detectives to a surprising location. Again, the last place where Allen was known to have been before he vanished was leaving the home of his surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola, near Chartres, and supposedly heading to Vichy for a business meeting. But his Audi had not been found in Chartres or in Vichy. Instead, it had been discovered abandoned in the parking lot of a train station in Orléans, which was a city roughly in between those two other cities. And so, to the police, it looked like he had gotten about halfway to his destination and then just stopped for some reason. When they had first located the car, the first thing they did was set up a surveillance team to watch it for 2 full days. They wanted to see if maybe Allen or somebody else would return to it. For context, the parking lot where the car was found was in a pretty rough part of town, an area where violent crime and sex work were common. So it was possible that any number of people could potentially approach the car or try to break into it. It just seemed like a seedy enough area where if they watched it long enough, something might happen. But after 2 days, nobody had shown up. So, finally, they just had the car towed to the impound lot so that forensic technicians could process it and look for any evidence. And Detective Martin was here to personally oversee that process. The forensic techs began to circle the vehicle, taking photos of the outside from every angle and carefully dusting for fingerprints. There was no visible damage anywhere on the exterior of the car, and there were no signs of any attempt to break into it. Plus, when they looked through the windows, they could see Allen's briefcase and his luggage were still sitting inside the car. This meant that the car being found where it was likely not the result of a simple car theft. This didn't seem like somebody just stole his car for a joyride and then dumped it. It seemed like how this car got here was directly connected to what had happened to Allen. And as he followed that line of thinking, it seemed more and more likely that what happened to Allen probably fell into the category of foul play. However, when the technicians finally opened up the car doors and began dusting for prints inside, the upholstery and the dashboard were disappointingly clean. There was nothing there. This didn't exactly support the idea that foul play had occurred inside the car. It just deepened the mystery. But after a few more minutes of thoroughly scanning the interior of the car, one of the technicians pushed a button near the driver's side door that electronically opened the trunk. After the trunk lid lifted open, Detective Martin walked around to the back of the SUV to look inside. And what he saw was a bulky object wrapped completely in a pink bedsheet. And right away, Martin had a sinking feeling in his chest as one of the techs reached forward with a gloved hand and carefully pulled the sheet back. And almost immediately, Martin's worst suspicions were confirmed. Underneath that pink sheet was a body. It was a man's body, fully clothed and curled up in the fetal position. There was no doubt in his mind that this was Allen Lilu. But there was no visible blood, no wounds, and no bruises anywhere on his body. And there was no blood in the trunk itself. When Detective Martin reached in to try to move Allen's body to examine him further, he found that his body was already incredibly rigid with rigor mortis. The coroner on the scene told Martin that she would hopefully have some answers for him after she conducted the autopsy. The weather over the past few weeks had been very cold, which was actually good for evidence collection because it basically meant the trunk had acted like a refrigerator, preserving Allen's soft tissues. As the coroner wheeled the body away on a gurney, Martin just stood there, staring at the now empty trunk. He had no theories about when or why or even how Allen had died. All he knew for certain was that this was now officially a murder investigation. Detective Martin returned to his office at the police station and got straight to work. Since Allen's body was found in Orleans, the jurisdiction for the case fell to him, and he was now in charge of the murder investigation. His first step was to review all the witness statements and all the other evidence that had already been gathered by the other police departments. And right away, the picture these files painted told Martin that this was going to be a very complex investigation with a lot of potential suspects and multiple locations to consider. Allen was a workaholic who was always on the move, and he had no apparent connection to the city of Orleans where his body had ended up. In fact, it seemed he rarely spent more than a few days in the same place. He didn't live with his wife. Instead, his life seemed to be a constant balancing act between his office, a series of hotels, with frequent stops at the home of a woman named Alexandra Nicola in between. According to the reports, Alexandra had been interviewed, and she had confirmed that Allen was at her house the weekend before he disappeared. And so, this made her the last known person to see Allen alive, which, in Martin's mind, automatically made her a person of interest. However, Alexandra's story about Allen leaving her house on Sunday, February 7th, seemed to match up perfectly with the data Martin had from Allen's car, his cell phone, and his credit card records. All of those records showed that Allen really did leave her house and travel to Orleans on that day, and then, for reasons that were still unknown, all communication and all financial activity just stopped. It seemed very likely that was the day he was killed. Right from the beginning, just like the young police officer who had originally visited Alexandra and taken her statement, Detective Martin found it very hard to believe that her relationship with Allen was not romantic. It just seemed, based on how frequently they saw each other and the fact that Allen was buying her major things like a house and a car and paying for vacations, that there had to be more to the story than what they were being told. But even though that cast a certain level of suspicion on Alexandra, there was also just the logical side of the situation for Detective Martin. The size difference between Allen and Alexandra was significant. Allen was a big guy. He weighed about 240 pounds. And Alexandra was very small and petite. Now, was it impossible for her to kill him, lift his body into the trunk of his car, and dump it in Orleans? No, it wasn't impossible. But it just seemed very unlikely. And so that idea was just sort of floating in the back of Detective Martin's mind. But for now, what Martin found himself much more interested in was some of the other information that Allen's business associates and his wife had provided. First off, Allen apparently had a lot of affairs with a lot of different women. And so, that meant that every single one of those women, and any husbands or boyfriends or other romantic partners connected to them, were also potential suspects. It also meant that Allen's wife, Elizabeth, had a very clear motive to want her husband dead. Basically, he was openly cheating on her all the time. That had to be a powerful motivation for her to want him gone. Now, Martin didn't think that Elizabeth would have literally done the killing herself because her phone records and other evidence showed she was actually 400 miles away at her home when her husband was likely killed. But she certainly had the financial means to hire a hitman to do it for her. And the second thing that Detective Martin learned from the business associates and from Allen's wife was that Allen's business dealings were both very high stakes and very ugly. Allen's employees and his colleagues clearly respected him, but they also described him as a very tough boss and a ruthless businessman. He could be very loud and abrasive, and he had made his fair share of enemies in the circus business, which was already known to be a cutthroat industry where a lot of money was always flying around. And so, because Martin had been handed this murder investigation with an overwhelming number of potential suspects, instead of just being paralyzed by where to even start, Martin assembled a team of his very best deputies. And they set to work, meticulously re-interviewing every single person connected to Allen, and, from those interviews, making a new, prioritized list of suspects. 3 weeks later, on March 17th, Detective Martin walked into an interrogation room in the Orleans police station. He sat down across from a relatively fit-looking 50-year-old man who was waiting for him quietly and seemed very calm. The man's name was Michel Delarue, and he was Allen's biggest rival in the circus business. He was also, at this very moment, Detective Martin's #1 suspect in this murder. Martin and his team had spent the last few weeks conducting dozens and dozens of interviews, and Michel's name had come up more times than anyone else's. And this was because immediately after Allen had disappeared, Michel had started aggressively contacting all of Allen's clients, trying to get them to sign new contracts with his company instead. It was a pretty cutthroat and cold-hearted thing to do. And Detective Martin had done the math on the value of these contracts Michel was going after. They added up to the equivalent of millions of dollars, which, in the detective's mind, was a very compelling motive for murder. Maybe Michel had killed Allen specifically to absorb his business. And not only that, but the coroner had, by this point, come back with Allen's official cause of death. He had been strangled, likely using some kind of ligature like a rope or a belt. And the coroner estimated that it likely took between 5 to maybe even 10 minutes for Allen to actually die. That meant that someone had been actively strangling him for a very long time. That is a long, physically demanding time to be right on top of somebody, killing them. And there were also some scratches found on Allen's legs, which suggested that his body had been lifted and dragged into the trunk after he was already dead. So the death struggle, the actual strangling, had clearly taken place somewhere else outside of the car, and all of that meant that whoever killed Allen had to be pretty strong. And looking at Michel now, Detective Martin thought that he certainly fit that description. He seemed like a fit, strong man. However, as Martin began asking Michel questions and watching his face and his body language for any signs of anxiety or defensiveness that might suggest he was hiding something, what he found was that Michel seemed completely open and very straightforward. He acted like he had nothing to hide. Michel immediately acknowledged that he had been trying to poach Allen's clients, but he just shrugged as he explained it. He said that was just business. He said he was sure that if their positions had been reversed, Allen would have done the exact same thing to him. And besides, he said, he had an airtight alibi. On the weekend, when the coroner believed Allen had been killed, Michel had been hundreds of miles away on a ski trip. And then Michel produced a folder that was full of receipts and a list of phone numbers of people who could verify his story. He handed it over to Martin, who took it. He told Michel to sit tight. Then the detective got up and left the interrogation room. He handed the folder over to another detective and told him to start checking everything out. But after that, Detective Martin did not go back into the interrogation room. Instead, he grabbed another detective and told them to go in and take a shot at questioning Michel. The idea was to create a sort of good cop, bad cop dynamic to see if maybe a new face and a new approach would rattle Michel. And so, Detective Martin watched from behind the two-way mirror as the next detective walked inside and tried to break Michel's story. But their conversation basically played out the same way that Martin's had. So, Martin signaled for yet another detective to go in there and have them take a shot. But they too had a very run-of-the-mill conversation with Michel and made no progress at all. And then finally, after basically hours of cycling different detectives into the room to try to catch Michel in a lie, Detective Martin felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around, and it was one of his deputies. The deputy told Martin that, unfortunately, he had called all the people on Michel's list, all the witnesses from the ski resort, and he had even spoken to the manager of the ski lodge. And basically, Michel's alibi was solid. It had checked out completely. He clearly could not have physically been able to kill Allen. He was verifiably at that ski resort at the time of the murder. At this point, Martin knew he couldn't just keep Michel there indefinitely, just hoping to catch him in a lie. Even if there was some remote possibility he was involved, there just wasn't enough evidence to hold him. And so, he had to let Michelle go. A few days later, Martin was back at his desk, combing through the case files again, when a uniformed officer came up and told him there was someone at the front desk who really wanted to talk to him. This was exactly the kind of news that Martin had been hoping for. He had recently put out a statement to the local newspapers, basically saying, "Hey, if there are any witnesses out there, please come in and talk to me." And he was hoping that whoever this person was potentially that witness. And so, Detective Martin followed the uniformed officer out to the lobby. And there, he saw the person who had come in to see him. It was a man who appeared to be in his early 50s, and he was dressed all in black, with shiny black shoes and dark glasses. Martin wondered if maybe this was another one of Alan's business contacts. And as he went up to shake the man's hand, he sort of felt himself getting excited. But then, this man introduced himself. And when he did, Martin had to resist the urge to just turn around and walk away right there. The man said his name was Remy Suren, and he was a professional psychic. Martin did not believe in psychics, and he was annoyed with the police officer for even wasting his time by bringing him out here to meet this person. And so Martin was literally about to just tell Remy, "Thanks for coming in, but I don't have time for this, you need to go." But then he thought better of it. The truth was, Martin was having absolutely no luck with this case. There had been very little forensic evidence recovered from Alan's car. There were no usable fingerprints. And while the pink bedsheet that Alan's body was wrapped in did have some DNA on it, it didn't match anything in their criminal database. And then, the business leads that Martin had been pretty excited about hadn't panned out either. And he'd found no evidence at all that anyone in either Alan's personal or business circles had taken out a paid hit on him. Martin's team had also spoken at length to Alan's surrogate daughter, Alexandra, and all the women he was having affairs with, and even all the sex workers they could find who he had engaged with. And none of them, nor any of their boyfriends or husbands or partners, made any sense as the killer. So, out of a mixture of a little bit of curiosity and a whole lot of desperation, Martin brought Remy, the psychic, back to an interrogation room and asked him what he thought he knew. Remy explained that he had heard a news bulletin about Alan while he was driving in his car. And when he heard the story, he had a vision that was so vivid and so powerful that he actually had to pull over to the side of the road. He said he saw Alan Lilu as clear as day, locked in a physical struggle with a woman. Remy didn't know her name, and he couldn't describe her face, but he was certain that a woman was somehow directly involved in Alan's murder. At first, Martin was disappointed. Unsurprisingly, this just felt like a generic stab in the dark by somebody pretending to be a psychic, someone who claimed they could see things that nobody else could. It just seemed like he threw out this random generic idea as if it was some big revelation, and it just didn't feel like it was. But Remy wasn't done. He went on to say that he was sure that Alan was not killed in Orléans, even though that's where his body had been found. He said Alan's body had been taken away from the murder scene and placed in the trunk of the car after he was already dead. And this immediately caught Martin's attention. Because the coroner had been certain that Alan was strangled in one place and then placed into the trunk afterwards for transport, but critically, the police had not released that specific piece of information to the press. They had held it back specifically so they could weed out fake tips and false confessions. And so, for Remy to say that, how would he have known that detail? Now, Martin knew this could have just been a lucky guess by Remy. But it just seemed so specific, so on the nose, that he began to reconsider what else Remy had said. This idea that Alan was struggling with a woman, that was something that Martin had not really considered seriously. He had sort of ruled most women out as the primary suspect because of how big Alan had been and how physical and brutal this murder had to have been. It just seemed much more likely that a big, strong man was responsible for the killing. But now, Martin wasn't so sure. And suddenly, it seemed entirely possible that maybe a woman really did do this. And so eventually, Detective Martin thanked Remy for coming in and sharing his ideas about the case. And after walking him out of the station, Detective Martin sped back to his desk because he had an idea. Lots of people in Alan's life had told the police investigating his murder that Alan had had many extramarital affairs. Now, Detective Martin and his team had already spoken to all the women they could possibly find who had had these affairs with Alan, and basically all of them had been ruled out. However, now, after talking with Remy the psychic, something about the location where Alan's body was found was jumping out at Detective Martin. The part of Orleans where Alan's car had been parked was pretty sketchy. It was crime-ridden, and critically, it was known for being a hotbed for sex work. Now, Martin already knew that Alan engaged with sex workers. That was one of the things he did. And they had spoken to numerous sex workers and ruled them out as suspects. And so, for the most part, sex workers were not really on Detective Martin's radar as a primary suspect pool. However, now, with fresh eyes, he was thinking, maybe the reason Alan was in Orleans in the first place was because he was there to meet a sex worker. And while he was there, something went terribly wrong, and it resulted in his death. So, Detective Martin spent the next few days absolutely scouring Alan's laptop. Now, the forensic techs had already been through it once, looking at all of Alan's emails and his business records. But Martin was looking for something different. He was using the laptop to search through all the websites where Alan had found sex workers to visit. Basically, what he was doing was making a new, truly exhaustive list of every single sex worker he had ever engaged with online. This was a much bigger list than they had before. There were dozens of names and profiles to sift through. And as Martin found them, he would send members of his team out to track down and speak to all the women he possibly could. But as he was doing this, Detective Martin discovered that really none of these sex workers that Alan was engaging with had any connection to the city of Orleans. And they also did not appear to have any real issues with Alan himself, at least not based on the messages that were on his laptop. However, as Detective Martin dug deeper and deeper into this laptop, going further and further back in time, he eventually came across one new profile. This woman was named Marie Eve. And when he took in who this woman was, and saw her picture, and read her information, he knew right then and there that he had solved the case. Based on the entire police investigation, as well as a full confession from the killer, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Alan Lilu on the day he was murdered. The killer found themselves standing behind Alan, and inside they were burning with a white-hot rage. Alan seemed to think he was so much better than the killer just because he was this powerful businessman, and the killer was, in his eyes, just a sex worker. The killer had tolerated Alan's condescending behavior for a long time because Alan had money and power. But now, Alan had pushed it too far. The killer felt like they had to shut him up for good. Alan's own belt lay on a nearby chair. And impulsively, the killer grabbed it. They lunged forward and looped the leather belt around Alan's throat from behind. At first, Alan struggled. He reached up with his large hands, trying to pull the belt off. He had no idea what was happening. But the killer just held on tight, pulling with all their might. And for several agonizing minutes, there was this unbelievable death struggle going on in the quiet house. And Alan, he was fighting for his life. He was a big guy, and he was getting close to pulling the belt free. But then, something unbelievable happened. The killer had braced themselves against the ironing board that was set up behind them. And so, with their back pressed up against it, they were pulling as hard as they could with the belt against Alan's throat. And as they were leaning back with all their weight, the ironing board they were braced against suddenly broke. The legs buckled. And because the killer didn't let go of the belt and was applying maximum pressure, when they fell backwards, it created a violent whiplash effect. Their body tumbled to the floor, and all of that force was driven instantly into Alan's throat. That sudden, violent jerk crushed Alan's larynx, and he immediately went still. And so, just for good measure, the killer held on for a couple more minutes, pulling as tightly as they could across his throat, really ensuring that Alan was dead. And when Alan did not move at all, eventually the killer let go of the belt and stood up, their heart pounding, just taking in the scene. Then, as reality began to set in for the killer, they realized they needed help getting rid of the body. This was a huge man. How were they going to get rid of it on their own? So, the killer called their accomplice. The accomplice was hundreds of miles away at a ski resort, but they immediately told the killer to wait and they would drive to them. Sure enough, the next day, the accomplice arrived. And together, they helped the killer load Alan's body into the trunk of Alan's own car. Then, the killer climbed into the driver's seat of Alan's car and drove it to the train station in Orléans. And following behind them as they made this grim journey was a second car being driven by the killer's accomplice. The killer and the accomplice would abandon Alan's car and his body in that rough part of Orléans, and then together they would drive away in the second car. Shortly thereafter, they would actually get married. Because the killer was Alan's own surrogate daughter, Alexandra Nicola. And Alexandra's troubled past that she was so defensive about included the fact that she was a sex worker who used the online name Marie-Eve. Her accomplice was her new boyfriend, Yves Bernard. So Alexandra and Alan had fought previously about her troubled history. She was especially mad that at one point, Alan had implied that Alexandra's daughter could end up just like her, as if that would be a horrible thing. So on that Saturday, February 6th, when Alan brought up Alexandra's daughter again, just in conversation, something inside of Alexandra snapped. It just felt so deeply disrespectful that he was once again talking about her daughter in that way, and out of pure impulse, she had grabbed his belt, wrapped it around his neck, strangled him, and then, in that freak accident, stumbled backwards, crushing his larynx and killing him. In a way, it was sort of true what Alexandra had told the police when they initially questioned her. Alan had left her house in his car on February 7th, and she had not seen him again. What she had conveniently left out was that Alan was already dead in the trunk of his car when he left. Alexandra Nicola confessed to the murder of Alan Lilu and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Yves Bernard, was sentenced to 2 years for the concealment of a dead body. The couple has since been released from prison, and together, they have a child who was born before Alexandra began her sentence. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One morning in 2017, 25-year-old Watanabe Takuya walked through the front doors of Keio University Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. He wasn't panicking and he wasn't asking for help right away, but something about him immediately felt off. His skin was drenched in sweat from a fever. A deep headache pulsed behind his eyes with every step he took. And as he approached the check-in desk, he kept one hand tightly pressed against his right ear. Fluid was leaking from it. For most people, symptoms like that would have been terrifying. But Takuya mainly felt annoyed, because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. Takuya had a long and difficult history with a condition known as cholesteatoma. It's basically a non-cancerous skin cyst that grows deep inside the ear canal, and it can cause a lot of problems if it's not treated. When Takuya was just a teenager, he'd had to go through multiple surgeries to get these cysts removed. The doctors had worked hard to make sure they got every last bit of it so it wouldn't come back. And for nearly a decade, it seemed like they had succeeded. The surgeries had worked. The cysts were gone, and he had been able to live a normal life without constant ear problems. But then, about 2 weeks before this hospital visit, the old, familiar symptoms started to return. He noticed a constant drainage coming out of his right ear. It was a clear sign that the cyst was back. Initially, Takuya had tried to ignore it. He was busy with work and life, and the idea of going back to the hospital, of possibly facing another surgery, was something he just didn't want to deal with. He put it off, hoping it might just clear up on its own, even though deep down he knew that was unlikely. But now, with the fever and the pounding headache, he couldn't deny it any longer. He was pretty sure the recurring cyst had caused him to develop a nasty ear infection. That would explain why he felt so sick. And so, here he was, back at the hospital, hand pressed to his ear, feeling frustrated with himself for waiting so long. He walked up to the check-in desk and explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist. She listened patiently, nodded, and typed all his information into the computer. Seeing the state he was in, she quickly had him admitted to the emergency room. About half an hour passed. Takuya was now lying in a bed in the emergency room. The bright, sterile lights of the room were so intense they felt like they were stabbing into his eyes, making his headache even worse. So he just kept his eyes closed. But even with his eyes shut, he could hear the quiet sounds of the ER, and he sensed a doctor standing right beside his bed. He listened as the doctor began to go over the results of the initial tests they had run. The doctor's voice was calm and professional. He confirmed what Takuya had already suspected. Based on his medical history and the fluid clearly leaking from his ear, they were almost certain that his cyst had returned and had led to a severe ear infection. The doctor then mentioned that it was very likely Takuya would need another surgery to get rid of the cyst once and for all. But then the doctor's tone shifted slightly. He said they didn't want to operate just yet. There was a bigger, more immediate problem they had to deal with first. The preliminary blood tests had shown something alarming. The doctor explained that Takuya's ear infection had become so bad that the infection had actually started to spread to the tissue surrounding his brain. This was an extremely dangerous development. It could lead to meningitis, permanent brain damage, and even death if it wasn't treated aggressively and immediately. When Takuya heard this, his annoyance and frustration were instantly replaced by a cold wave of shock and fear. This was far more serious than he had ever imagined. But more than anything, he just felt angry at himself. He knew with a sinking feeling that if he had just come to the hospital 2 weeks ago when the drainage first started, the infection likely never would have gotten this bad. He had tried to avoid the problem, and now it had spiraled into something life-threatening. It was too late for regrets now. Takuya forced his eyes open, squinting against the painful light, and looked at the doctor. He asked what they could do. The doctor laid out the plan. They were going to admit him to the hospital, not just keep him in the ER, and start him immediately on a very powerful intravenous dose of antibiotics to fight the infection that was threatening his brain. 2 weeks later, Takuya was still a patient in the hospital. He was lying flat on his back, being slowly rolled into the large, white, donut-shaped ring of a CT machine. The machine would scan the inside of his head, giving the doctors a detailed picture of what was going on. By this point, the powerful antibiotics had done their job. The dangerous infection around his brain had been cured, his fever was gone, and his headache had finally subsided. He was feeling much better. But despite this progress, one symptom remained. His ear was still leaking fluid. It wasn't constant anymore, but it was still happening on and off, a sign that the root problem was still there. And so, the doctors had ordered this CT scan. Their goal was to look inside Takuya's head, pinpoint the exact location and size of the suspected cyst, and map out exactly how they were going to approach the surgery to remove it. Takuya laid perfectly still for about 5 minutes as the CT machine whirred and clicked around him, taking hundreds of images of his skull and brain. When it was finished, a nurse helped him out of the machine and led him back to his hospital room to wait. A little while later, one of the hospital doctors came into his room holding a folder with some papers inside. The doctor told Takuya that based on the results of the CT scan, he had some good news. Takuya actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. For a moment, Takuya felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. He had been mentally preparing himself for another operation, and the news that it wasn't necessary was incredible. But that happy feeling only lasted for a second. He saw the doctor's expression shift. The professional calm was gone, replaced by a deeply troubled look. The doctor then explained the reason why he didn't need surgery for a cyst. It was because there was no cyst in his ear at all. The real problem, the actual cause of all his symptoms, was something much, much worse. The doctor pulled an image from the stack of papers and handed it to Takuya. It was a cross-section from his CT scan. When Takuya looked at it, he could not believe what he was seeing. It would turn out Takuya had an extremely rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. It is a mysterious and devastating illness where the body's own systems, for no known reason, begin to break down and absorb its own bone tissue. In Takuya's case, the bones of his skull were literally disappearing, dissolving away almost like an ice cube melting in the sun. And that fluid that had been leaking out of his ear for weeks? It wasn't from an infection. It was cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that cushions the brain, which was now flowing out through the holes that were forming in his skull. Unfortunately, then and now, there is no known cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The best doctors can do is try to manage the symptoms and patch the damage as it occurs. And that's exactly what they did for Takuya. Surgeons went in and used a special kind of biomedical glue to literally plug up the holes that were forming in his skull. Amazingly, the procedure seemed to work. Takuya's doctors monitored him closely for any further bone loss and fluid leakage. As of his most recent publicly released checkup in 2018, he appeared to be doing quite well. One afternoon in late January of 2018, a father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his 3 kids shared in their house in Madison, Wisconsin. With a sigh of frustration, Dan grabbed his kids' toothbrushes from the holder by the sink and threw them straight into the garbage can. Then he picked up a bottle of disinfectant spray and went to work, spraying the counters, the sink, the faucet, the mirror, basically every single surface he could see, and began wiping everything down with paper towels. Dan was doing this deep clean because his entire family, himself, his wife, and their 3 young children all had strep throat. Their family doctor had explained that the best way to get rid of it for good was a 2-pronged attack. Everybody had to take a full course of antibiotics, and they had to deep clean the house from top to bottom to get rid of any lingering bacteria that might have caused the infection. However, as Dan scrubbed down the bathroom counters, he felt a deep sense of frustration. This was not the first time his family had gone through this exact routine. This was not the second or third time either. Over the past 4 months, his entire family had come down with strep throat a staggering 6 times. And no matter how many antibiotics they took, or how many times they threw out their toothbrushes and deep cleaned the entire house, it felt like the sickness always found a way to come back. It was a miserable, unending cycle. This was especially baffling to Dan because he was actually a biologist. He understood bacteria and how infections spread better than most people. He had already gone through a mental checklist of every possible source for this recurring infection. He checked at his own workplace and his wife's, but nobody else was getting sick. He checked with his kids' school and their daycare, and again, no other children or staff members were repeatedly getting strep. So he knew the infection couldn't be coming from any of those places. This just didn't make any sense. If the source wasn't outside the home, it had to be inside. But each of the 6 times they got sick, Dan and his wife had been incredibly thorough. They had systematically disinfected the entire house, going far beyond just the bathrooms. They cleaned every doorknob, every light switch, every toy, every surface they could think of. If there was strep bacteria hiding somewhere in the house, it surely should have been wiped out by now. It was as if the bacteria was somehow surviving their cleaning blitz, hiding in some place they had never thought to look. He just couldn't figure out where it could be. But regardless, Dan still dutifully finished disinfecting the bathroom for the 6th time. When he was done, he went to the kitchen. On the counter was a small pile of prescription bottles, antibiotics for the whole family. Dan took his own dose and then prepared the doses for everyone else. He went to his daughter's room first. His 2 girls, who were 6 and 3 years old, were both lying in their beds, looking completely miserable and flushed with fever. He gave them their medicine before heading to his and his wife's bedroom. He found his wife sitting up in bed, and she was cuddling their very sick 1-year-old son. Dan handed his wife her antibiotics and then looked down at his son. The little boy looked so small and so vulnerable, and it just broke Dan's heart to think about how many times this poor kid had been sick in his short life, and how powerless he, as a father, felt to protect him. Dan felt like they were doing everything right. They were following the doctor's orders to the letter, but they were now on their 7th round of illness, and clearly, nothing was changing. The advice they were getting wasn't helping. It felt like they were trapped in an awful nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But then, as Dan stood there feeling utterly defeated, he thought of something. His own mother was a retired pediatrician. She had decades of experience, and maybe, just maybe, she might have a different perspective or some advice that their current doctor hadn't considered. So, he sat down on the edge of the bed, took out his phone, and called his mom to explain the situation and ask for help. And it turned out Dan's mom did have a theory. It was a theory about where this relentless strep bacteria was coming from and how to finally get rid of it. But because Dan was a biologist and he understood how bacteria functioned on a scientific level, he knew that his mother's theory was, to put it mildly, out there. Most scientists and medical professionals would probably say that her idea was basically impossible. But at this point, after 6 bouts of strep throat, Dan and his family were desperate. They were ready to try anything, no matter how unconventional it seemed. So, Dan decided he would try to test his mother's theory. He began looking for an expert who could help him. But every expert Dan got in touch with, every lab and every doctor he called, turned him down as soon as they heard what his theory actually was. Nobody was prepared to even entertain the idea. It felt like he was so close to finding an answer, to finally curing his family of this horrible problem, but he was being blocked at every turn because the medical community wouldn't even consider it as a possibility. About a month later, in early March, Dan was inside a hospital room sitting next to his wife. They were both staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, looking tiny and frail, hooked up to an IV drip and wearing an oxygen mask. She had gotten strep throat for the 7th time. And this time, it was much worse. She had gotten so sick that she had also developed pneumonia. At this point, Dan and his wife weren't even sure if she was going to survive. For Dan, this was the absolute breaking point. He was on the verge of a complete breakdown. He was convinced that the only way to save his children was to find someone, anyone, who would be willing to test his mother's theory. But they had already been turned down by basically every expert in the entire state of Wisconsin. Dan had no idea who else to turn to. As they sat there in the tense silence of the hospital room, watching their little girl fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him. She had an idea. What if, instead of asking established medical professionals for help, they tried asking medical students? Maybe a student, someone more open-minded and not so set in their ways, would be more willing to test out a theory, even if it did seem kind of crazy. Dan agreed. It was a long shot, a final Hail Mary, but it was definitely worth a try. They reached out to the University of Wisconsin, and this time their desperate plea actually worked. On the 4th of April 2018, about 6 months after the first strep outbreak in their house, Dan and his wife took one very specific thing from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin. The student they had contacted agreed to analyze it. And after the analysis was complete, the results determined that Dan and his family's crazy theory was correct. It would turn out that Dan, his wife, and their 3 kids were not the only ones in their home suffering from strep throat. There was actually a 6th victim, their pet cat. Now, most veterinarians at the time didn't believe that cats could even catch the specific strain of strep that affects humans, let alone transmit it back to them. That's why all the professionals had refused to even test the family's cat. It went against everything they had been taught. It was not until Dan contacted the University of Wisconsin's veterinary school that a student finally agreed to run the test. And lo and behold, the test came back positive for the exact same strain of strep bacteria that the family kept catching. Their beloved cat was the carrier, constantly reinfecting them after every round of antibiotics. Dan's 3-year-old daughter would go on to make a full recovery from her pneumonia. And after one final round of antibiotics, this time including a dose for the cat, and one last deep clean of the house, the family's nightmare with strep throat finally went away for good. On the 30th of September 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband just outside the door to her parents' apartment in a little city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath, the key trembling slightly in her hand. Then she unlocked the door and stepped slowly into her parents' home. Charlotte was here because of a sudden and terrible tragedy. Both of her parents had passed away just a few days ago. They had only been 70 and 76 years old, and by all accounts, they had both been in good health for their age. The story she had been told was as shocking as it was tragic. Her father had apparently suffered a massive heart attack right in their kitchen. And then, when her mother found him, the shock of it all was so great that she also had a heart attack and collapsed beside him. Charlotte's mother had managed to make a call to a doctor just before she passed, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. Both of them were gone. Now, Charlotte and her husband didn't live in Germany. They had flown in that morning all the way from their home in Wisconsin. And up until this point, Charlotte had been trying to hold her emotions together, to be strong through the travel and the initial arrangements. But now, standing inside her parents' living room, surrounded by all of their familiar belongings, the pictures on the wall, the furniture they had owned for years, it was like a dam inside of her just broke. All of the grief and shock she had been holding back just poured out of her, and she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. Her husband, not really knowing what else to do, gently guided her over to the couch. He turned on the television to a quiet program, hoping it might be a small distraction, and told her to just sit down and rest for a bit before they had to think about dinner. They actually had plans that evening. The next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Caroline, who had been friends with her parents for years, had offered to come over and cook dinner for them. Charlotte's uncle, Dear, who lived nearby, also planned to come over after dinner to be with them. About 30 minutes later, while Charlotte was still sitting on the couch trying to compose herself while watching TV, Caroline, the neighbor, showed up at the door. She came in with 2 big bags full of groceries and, without any fuss, went right into the kitchen and began to cook. Pretty soon, the entire apartment, which had felt so empty and sad, was filled with the smell of comfort food cooking on the stove. It made Charlotte feel, admittedly, a little bit better. Eventually, Caroline called out from the kitchen that dinner was almost ready. So Charlotte got up from the couch, went into the kitchen, and sat down at the small dining table next to her husband. After Caroline served the food, the 3 of them began to eat together while they waited for her Uncle Dear to arrive. Not long after, Uncle Dear did arrive. He walked up to the front door of the apartment and knocked. He waited for a full minute, but nobody came to the door. Thinking maybe they hadn't heard him, he knocked again, louder this time. But still there was no answer. This was strange. Through the door, Dear could hear the sound of the television playing in the living room, but he couldn't hear any voices, no conversation, no sound of anyone moving around inside. After a couple more minutes of waiting and knocking, he decided he would just let himself in. The door was unlocked. As Dear walked through the living room, he began calling out for Charlotte, for her husband, and for Caroline. But still, nobody called back. The apartment was eerily quiet except for the noise from the TV. An uneasy feeling started to creep over him. This was very weird. They were expecting him, so where was everybody? He walked out of the living room and headed towards the kitchen, where a light was on. And there, he saw them. Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline were all sitting at the kitchen table. But something was terribly wrong. All 3 of them were just sitting there, motionless. Their plates of food were half eaten in front of them. But nobody was moving. Nobody was talking. It was like they were frozen in time, all just staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. Dear, confused and concerned, walked closer. He bent down and spoke to his niece. "Charlotte? What's going on? What are you guys doing?" But when he got a good close look at Charlotte's face, and then at Caroline's face, and her husband's face, his stomach just dropped. A wave of pure horror washed over him, and he stumbled backwards away from the table. What Dear saw in that kitchen was so terrifying, so eerie, and so awful, it would actually make international news. And that apartment would forever be known by a chilling nickname, the Death House. It turned out Charlotte's parents had not died from spontaneous heart attacks on the same day. That's not what happened at all. The tragic truth was that toxic, odorless sewer gas had been leaking into the apartment through a broken pipe under the kitchen sink. That silent, invisible gas had poisoned both of Charlotte's parents, causing their hearts to stop at almost the same time. Because no one suspected poisoning, nobody thought to check for a gas leak. So, when Charlotte and her husband arrived from Wisconsin, they came to stay in her parents' apartment without any idea that the air inside was still filled with that same deadly gas. And so, as Charlotte, her husband, and their kind neighbor Caroline sat down for dinner in the kitchen, right near the source of the leak, the gas slowly poisoned them as well. When Dear finally came over, he found them all sitting around the kitchen table, frozen in their last moments, because they were already gone. Fortunately, Dear's instinct after seeing the horrific scene was to immediately get out of the apartment and go call the authorities. It was that single, quick decision that ultimately saved his life. Let me know in the comments which of these three stories disturbed you the finest. Was it the man whose skull was slowly disappearing without him even realizing it? The family that kept getting mysteriously sick because the source of the infection was sleeping in their own home? Or the apartment where people unknowingly sat down for dinner inside a room that was silently killing them? And remember, some of the most terrifying things in the world don't look dangerous at all until it's already too late. If you want another story that will stick in your head long after the video ends, there's a full playlist waiting for you right now. See ya! In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in a small farmhouse in rural Ohio. He heard his bedroom door creak open. He figured it was probably just his great-grandparents, Jack and Linda, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. So, being a little kid, he just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. He heard the floorboards groan as whoever it was walked slowly across the room. He could hear them getting closer and closer. And then the sounds stopped. They were standing right next to his bed, looking down at him. He could almost feel them there. His curiosity got the better of him. He opened his eyes, just a tiny crack, just enough to peek. But what he saw standing there in the dark was not his great-grandmother or his great-grandfather. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet, 2-lane road in Darkey County, Ohio. Darkey County was the kind of place that was mostly made up of very small towns, separated by huge stretches of farmland. It was peaceful. As Linda drove, the sun was setting over a wide-open field, casting long shadows across the road. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned together in a nearby town. It was a normal end to a normal day. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. She parked her car in front of their old farmhouse, a place that felt like home in every way. She reached into the back seat and grabbed the deposit bag. It was full of the cash earnings from the pizza shop for that day. She got out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside settled around her. The farm was so isolated that you couldn't hear any traffic from the main road. The only sounds were the sheep bleating softly in the pasture and the hum of power tools coming from the big barn out back. She walked around to the back of the barn, and there was Jack. He was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, tinkering away. Jack and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, she truly felt like she had found her soulmate. He was a hard worker. On top of co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant. And, as if that wasn't enough, he ran a side business restoring classic cars. Linda often found him out here working on a car as the sun went down. It was just who he was. Sitting in the grass next to the car, playing with a small wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, jumped to his feet, and ran over to give her a big, tight hug. Seeing Damien's happy face always made Linda feel a little bittersweet. Damien was the son of her granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and wasn't in any position to raise a baby. So, Linda and Jack had stepped in. They offered to take Damien and raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, and it came with its own set of problems. One of the biggest problems was Damien's father. He was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement and having limited access to his son. Even now, 4 years later, he still argued with Linda about it. He would insist that he wanted to be a part of Damien's life, but Linda was worried. She had a deep fear that he would eventually just abandon the boy, and she couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of pain. So, she kept him at a distance. Besides, Linda thought Damien was going to have another father figure in his life very soon. In the past few years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. Their plan was to take Damien in and raise him themselves as soon as he finished his current year of preschool, which was only a couple of months away. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber and how much she had matured. But she also felt a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss having Damien around the farm. They loved him more than anything. In many ways, he was like their own son. Linda could see that Jack was completely focused on the car engine and probably didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him toward the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set Damien down inside, and told him to go wash his hands for dinner. Then she walked into the kitchen and tossed the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda got a pan out and started cooking dinner. A few minutes later, her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms covered in car grease. While Jack washed up at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him how his day had been. Jack just grumbled a bit. He was annoyed about a customer he'd sold a car to on a payment plan the year before. The customer had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the guy's house the next day and repossess the car. Linda could tell Jack was tense, but she knew it wasn't just about the missed car payment. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week or so. It all started after he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid who was really close with his dad. He had even been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life seemed to be falling apart. He was going through a messy divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he had been skipping shifts at his job. Earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm asking Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on. But Jack had decided it was time for some tough love. He drew a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act and get back to work. That conversation had turned into a massive fight. Now, Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried he had done permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was probably afraid that history was repeating itself. Something similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis, about 7 years earlier. When Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into an argument that was so bad, Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda thought Jack must be terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. So, while Jack stood at the sink, scrubbing the grease from his hands, Linda came up behind him and gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders and just needed a little push to get back on the right track. That's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right decision and that Greg would get through this rough patch. After that, Linda set the table and called everyone for dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock. She realized it was getting pretty late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and cranky. So she picked him up and carried him upstairs to his room to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas, brushed his teeth for him, and then tucked him into his bed. She gave him a kiss on his forehead, whispered good night, and quietly closed the door behind her. Linda went back downstairs. Before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. A short time later, Linda was in their bedroom. She had a small lamp on. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, and the room went dark. Soon, they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, in the middle of the night, Linda was jolted awake by a horribly loud noise. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked around the dark room, trying to figure out what had happened. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that made her gasp. The next morning, at a church just a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children started to arrive, she noticed there was one empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't totally unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents were busy people. They ran a farm, a pizza shop, and a car restoration business. She figured they were probably just running a little behind schedule. So she started the class as usual, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day. About an hour later, around 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled, and he was out of breath. He wasn't wearing his backpack. He was still in his pajamas. And there was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his shirt. She immediately ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized the brown spot on his shirt was dried blood. The teacher's heart sank. She gently asked Damien what was going on. He looked up at her with a scared and confused expression on his little face. He told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker and his partner were driving their patrol car down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darker County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was the head of the investigative unit. When the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to see what was going on. The preschool teacher on the phone had sounded frantic. She said a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, and was saying something bizarre about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher gave the police the names of the great-grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, and their address. Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could have meant by that strange phrase, or what kind of scene he and his partner were about to walk into, but he had a very bad feeling about it. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields. It felt completely isolated. Whitaker started walking towards the front of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already wide open. He didn't see any obvious signs of a forced entry, like a kicked-in door or a broken lock, but it was still unsettling. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully over the threshold and into the house. Whitaker called out, announcing their presence, asking if anyone was home. But there was no response. The only sound was the wind whistling through the open door. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door across the room. It led to a set of stairs going down, probably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now and focus on clearing the main floor first. He and his partner moved cautiously through the house. They went into the kitchen. It was empty. Once they were sure it was clear, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. Whitaker pushed the door open and stepped inside. And that's when he found them. Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, were lying in their bed side by side. It was obvious from the moment he saw them that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could immediately see a large dark wound on the back of Jack's neck. It looked like a bullet wound. Linda was lying on her back. She had gunshot wounds on her face and on her hand, as if she had raised her hand in a last desperate attempt to defend herself just before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house just to make sure the killer wasn't still hiding somewhere inside. The house was empty. So the two of them returned to the master bedroom to begin the difficult task of processing the crime scene. Whitaker pulled on a pair of latex gloves and gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on that, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for bullet casings. He couldn't find any. This told him something important. It meant the killer had been careful. They had taken the time to pick up the spent casings afterwards to cover their track. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. There was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. It was a piece of quilting fabric that had been wadded up into a ball and then covered in layers of masking tape. He turned it over in his gloved hands. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had probably taped it to the end of their gun to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. It must have been blown off when they started firing. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were out here in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbors were far away, but then he remembered who else was in the house. He left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs. The room directly above where the murders had taken place was another bedroom. This one was filled with stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And that's when it clicked for Whitaker. The killer must have known there was a toddler sleeping right upstairs. They needed the silencer because they didn't want to wake the child when they committed the murders. And this meant one thing for sure. The killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office arrived and began to swarm the property. Whitaker went back outside to supervise them as they set up a perimeter and started their search for evidence. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over. They had found a set of footprints in the soft mud near the side of the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints, which led them around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane had been carefully pried off, leaving an open hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the opening. Inside, he could see a set of stairs leading up to the main floor of the house. This had to be how the killer got inside. It also explained why that basement door had been standing wide open when they first entered the house. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that the killer was someone close to the family. They obviously knew the layout of the house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, it would tell them the type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wire was cleanly severed. The killer had planned this meticulously. They had made sure that no one inside the house would be able to call for help. Just then, a pickup truck pulled up at the end of the road. A woman got out and started walking hesitantly toward the house. Whitaker quickly walked over to intercept her, making sure she didn't get too close and contaminate the crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars and didn't know what was going on, but she thought she had some information that might be helpful. The neighbor told Whitaker that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the minivan, but the vehicle itself had stuck out in her memory. As far as she knew, the Myers family did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. If that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially huge piece of the puzzle. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, Whitaker went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to figure out a motive. He was convinced that whoever did this knew Jack and Linda, but that didn't explain why. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it revenge for some old grudge? He didn't know. As he walked through the house, he found that deposit bag full of cash that Linda had brought home. It was sitting in plain sight in the living room. It hadn't been touched. There were also some expensive electronics in the living room, a TV, and a stereo system that were also untouched. This pretty much ruled out robbery as a motive. So Whitaker went back upstairs to take another closer look at the toddler's bedroom. As he scanned the room, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small reddish-brown stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While forensics teams were still carefully combing over every inch of the farmhouse, another investigator on the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, drove to the local preschool. His task was to speak with the only potential witness, 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of sympathy for this little boy who was sitting in a small office looking scared and utterly confused. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic, but he was their best hope of figuring out what had happened to his great-grandparents. Burns sat down on the floor with Damien in a private room. He spoke in a soft, calm voice and asked the little boy to try and explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in the simple way that a 4-year-old talks, said he had woken up around 8:45. The house was very, very quiet. So, he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said they were both in their bed, and at first, he just thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then, he saw that there was blood on their faces. He said he tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes, but there was just so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He said he thought for a moment that their faces were melting. And so, thinking he needed to get help for them, he had run the entire mile down the road to his preschool. Burns was amazed that a child so young could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. He was also grateful. The boy's story explained why there was blood on his pajama shirt. But it still didn't explain the small spot of blood they'd found on Damien's own bed. So, Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he went straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt like there had to be more to the story. He just couldn't explain how that bloodstain got onto Damien's bed. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small toy figures. He asked Damien if he could act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien took the toy that represented himself and put it into a bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the Jack and Linda toys into the bed in the other room. He said that everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtime. But then, he said, later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just describing a nightmare or if his imagination was running wild. But then, Damien put the toys down. To represent the green monster, he used his fingers, and he made them crawl across the floor of the dollhouse, moving slowly toward his own bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open, and he had opened his eyes just a tiny bit. He didn't want whoever it was to know he was awake, so he was just squinting. And when he did that, he saw the green monster standing right next to his bed, and the green monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien said he was so scared that he squeezed his eyes shut as tight as he could and just pretended to be asleep. And then, when he finally dared to open his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's memory was almost certainly not a dream. It was all too real. More than likely, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, a 19-year-old named Amber Holscher. So, the detective drove out to Amber's house in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders, so Amber had no idea why a detective was suddenly standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this would be difficult, so he gently asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Confused, Amber said, "Okay," and let him in. They sat down in her living room. Then Burns told her as gently as he could that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. When Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. "Where are they?" she asked. Burns took a deep breath and had to clarify that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked. Her eyes filled with tears, and the first thing she asked was, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. He told her that Damien was alive and safe, but that he was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were worried that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to hurt Damien too. And until they had a suspect, Damien would not be allowed to see anyone in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and started to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his main focus was on Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible. Every day that went by was another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based on Amber's genuine shock and her immediate concern for her son, Burns felt it was highly unlikely that she was involved. Damien also hadn't mentioned seeing his mother at the farmhouse, but she might know something that could help them. Once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. Right away, she nodded. She mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, she said, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and had started a big fight with her about custody. The argument had gotten so heated that Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This immediately caught Burns's attention. It provided a clear and powerful motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier time getting custody of Damien, so he thanked Amber for her help and promised he would be in touch soon. The moment he got back to his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him what he had learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew came to the door and let them inside. He sat down and looked at them, waiting for them to explain why they were there. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered, and they watched his reaction very closely. He seemed surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew openly admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had in fact threatened to kill Linda, but he swore he would never actually do something like that. He said it was just an empty threat made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew seemed very suspicious. So, he asked him for an alibi for the night of the murders. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house that night. In the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house, and then he had gone straight to work. He told them they could ask all of those people, and they would all confirm his story. Whitaker wrote all of this down. He asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's house, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They drove to the girlfriend's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And finally, they went to his place of work. And every single person at all three locations confirmed Andrew's story. His alibi was solid. Unless all of them were lying, there was simply no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like a dead end. And he was very aware that every moment this case went unsolved was another moment that little Damien had to spend all alone away from his family. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother, was sitting in his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was proving to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, other sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. Several family members had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had looked into Travis's background, he found that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It seemed like Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually had no idea where Travis was. There was no other address on record for him. So, Burns basically had no way of finding him. He decided his best bet was to start by visiting Travis's younger brother, Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, it was the only lead he had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man in a baseball cap opened the door. It was clear from his red, swollen eyes that he had been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg didn't seem surprised by the visit at all. He said the police had already called him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murders. He said that since then, he'd just been waiting for an officer to come by and talk to him. He said he'd seen enough TV shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But as they walked into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here hoping to maybe get a lead on where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg explained that Travis had actually been in Ohio for the past several weeks. He had been staying in an apartment he had rented nearby. Burns thought the timing of this seemed incredibly suspicious. It was just too convenient that Travis had come back to town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And something about the scene just felt off. The two brothers just standing there waiting for the police to come and question them. It didn't sit right with him. So Burns, acting on a gut instinct, told them both that he needed to question them formally. He said they would have to come with him down to the station. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns led Greg and Travis Myers into the Dark County Sheriff's Office. Neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, but Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them might be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while his partner took Travis into an interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down, Burns noticed that he wasn't making any eye contact. He was fidgeting and acting shifty. But Greg quickly said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. So Burns began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that he was mostly just asleep. That is, until about 4:30, when he got up to go to his job at a factory a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the entire night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card at home that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Remember, the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 that morning, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi was a little shaky, the timing alone seemed to rule him out. It seemed basically impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in by 5:23. There just didn't seem to be enough time to do all of that. Also, pretty much everyone in the family had told Burns that Greg was actually quite close with Jack and Linda. Yes, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg was still technically a suspect, Burns decided to shift his focus to Travis. Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about the murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but he had mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, since Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken. He said those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that big falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. After that, Travis had just quit the family business and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if he did, that would certainly be a solid motive for murder. So, Burns made 2 mental notes. First, check into Greg's alibi more thoroughly. And second, look into Jack's will to see how his assets were supposed to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. He went right down the hall and waited outside the room where his partner was questioning Travis. Later, Burns's partner told him that Travis had seemed really nervous from the moment he stepped into the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently and realized he had never actually met his brother Greg's children. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing at the time Jack and Linda were killed. Travis stuttered and said he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked if he had anyone who could confirm that. Travis hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car. It was a white minivan. After getting the summary from his partner, Burns went back to his office. By this point, Greg had been moved to a different room. Burns sat down at his desk and began going over the evidence they had collected so far. The investigation had been moving very quickly, so there actually wasn't a whole lot of physical evidence processed yet. It had only been 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on just about everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited was to follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. They were the victim's sons, he already believed the killer was close to the family, and they both drove minivans. Really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's office phone rang. He picked it up. It was a local man who said he had seen a news report about the murders of Jack and Linda Myers. And he had some information that he thought might help. The man said that a few days earlier, a friend of his had called him to ask if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man asked his friend why he needed a gun, the friend said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who the murderer was. Based on that crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of the 27th of March 2003. Early that morning, the killer woke up, got out of bed, and immediately put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all of their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of the countryside. They were calm at first, but as they turned onto the long gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned everything out perfectly and had prepared for anything that could possibly go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still sitting in the car, they climbed into the backseat of the minivan and grabbed their shotgun. They took a piece of thick quilting fabric, wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and used masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they did this, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous. As much as they had planned for this moment, it really wasn't something they wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. After their gun had its silencer, they slung it over their shoulder. They got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside could call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside. There they were, sleeping in their bed. The killer took a deep breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was too strong for the homemade silencer. It blew right off. So the shot wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. From the chaos, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer and saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. In a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand. The other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and listened. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the next two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person they knew was in the house. A person they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure there were no loose ends, they left Linda in Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside, carefully walked over to the boy's bed, raised their shotgun, and aimed it at the child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and backed out of the room. Once they were back in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their bloody clothes into a river. Then they changed into their work clothes and drove to the factory, where they clocked in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they had been fighting about it. Greg knew that he would inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, he decided that murder was his only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. His alibi was just barely possible. Greg was arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The investigation moved so quickly that police were still gathering evidence to use against him even after he was in custody. They later found the shotgun, the other supplies, and a pair of shoes that matched the prints found in the mud outside the house, all in a river right near the farm. Fingerprints and store receipts tied all of the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he went to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now grown up and doing very well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the year 2015, a 29-year-old man named Johnny Coxey and his 25-year-old wife, Megan Coxey, were living in a very low-income section of Spartanburg, South Carolina. Johnny and Megan were in a really tough spot. They both struggled mightily with drug addiction, making it nearly impossible to hold down steady work. Because they did not have any steady income, they often found themselves out on the streets, begging people for spare change just to buy their next meal. Their heavy drug use also made it nearly impossible for them to be good parents to their only child. In fact, in December of that year, things got so bad that Child Protective Services had to step in and officially take their child away from them. And if that was not already bad enough, almost immediately after their child was taken, both Megan and Johnny were arrested and thrown in jail for various offenses that were directly connected to their drug habits. So, Johnny and Megan were at absolute rock bottom at this point. They were sitting inside cold jail cells, feeling hopeless and wondering how they were ever going to put their lives back together. But they were about to get what seemed like a major break. After they got out of jail, which was only after a couple of days, Megan was contacted by a very successful local real estate agent named Todd Kapp. Now, Todd was someone she had met previously when she used to work as a waitress at a local diner in town. Todd had been a regular customer there, and they had struck up casual conversations in the past. Todd was reaching out to her to make an offer that seemed almost too good to be true. He wanted to offer Megan and her husband pretty decent paying jobs. Todd explained that he had recently purchased a massive 95-acre plot of land in the area, and he needed people to come out to the property and help him clean it up. He needed them to clear out the thick brush and clean up some of the old buildings that were scattered across the land. Todd's plan was to develop this property further in the future, and he had been reaching out to other people in Spartanburg to see if they wanted to earn some quick cash. Megan and Johnny were two of the people he decided to contact. Of course, Megan and Johnny immediately said yes. They were in desperate need of cash, and paying jobs did not come around very often. On December 19th of that year, Megan spoke to her mother on the phone and excitedly told her about this new job opportunity. She told her mother exactly where the property was and what she and Johnny would be doing. After that call, she and Johnny packed up a few things and made their way out to the property. When they arrived, they saw a massive chain-link fence wrapped around what looked like a giant dense forest. This forest was the 95-acre plot of land that Todd owned. Somewhere near the center of this dense forest were a few buildings that Johnny and Megan were supposed to clean. The couple drove along the fence line until they finally found the break in the fence. That break led directly to a dirt access road. They turned onto the road and began driving deep into the heart of this dark, thick forest. 3 days later, Megan's mother tried to get in touch with her, but she could not get through. When she tried to call Johnny, she could not reach him either. Both of their phones went straight to voicemail. Given the couple's history with drugs, Megan's mother immediately feared the worst. She thought that maybe they had gotten paid, used the money to buy drugs, and then tragically overdosed somewhere. In a panic, she rushed over to Megan and Johnny's house to check on them, but they were not there. At this point, something in her gut told her that something was seriously wrong. It was absolutely not common for them to go completely off the grid like this, so she immediately called the police and reported them missing. The police began their investigation by speaking to Todd Kapp. Since Todd was the owner of the property and the person who hired them, he was presumably one of the last people to see them before they went missing. But when the officers spoke to Todd, he was very calm and cooperative. He told them that he had very limited interaction with the couple. He said they came out to his property, cleaned up 2 of his buildings, and then he paid them in cash and they left. He claimed they had not had any contact since then and that he had absolutely no clue where they would have gone. At this point, the police decided their best bet was just to wait and see what happened. The police had a running suspicion that the couple used the money from cleaning up the property to buy drugs and went on a binge. They figured the couple would either turn up in a few days when the drugs ran out, or they would be found dead somewhere from an overdose. But a couple of days went by and the couple did not reemerge. A couple of weeks went by, and then a couple of months went by. It was not long before the investigation completely stalled and the case went cold. But the case would not stay cold for very long. On August 31st, 2016, which was roughly 8 months after the Coxies were reported missing, 2 more residents of Spartanburg went missing as well. They were 30-year-old Caleb Brown, who also went by the name Kayla, and her boyfriend, 32-year-old Charlie Carver. The pair had only been dating for about a month, but they were already becoming quite serious. Charlie had already introduced Kayla to his family, a step that Charlie's father later said was a very big deal for his son. Unlike the Coxies, Kayla and Charlie were not struggling with drug addiction or financial issues. They were actually pretty well off. Charlie worked full-time operating a printer at a local business, and Kayla made a living by doing various odd jobs around town. According to their families, the couple was very happy with their lives and the direction they were going. But starting on the evening of August 31st, Kayla and Charlie stopped returning text messages and answering phone calls. Charlie's father was especially close with Charlie, so the sudden silence was immediately noticed by him. But at first, he tried to rule out any bad thoughts. He thought to himself that there was probably a reasonable explanation for why his son was not texting him back, and that he would hear from him over the next couple of days. But over the next couple of days, Charlie continued not to answer any text messages or pick up any phone calls, and the same was true for Kayla. After 48 hours of this total silence, Charlie's father finally hopped in his car and drove over to his son's house to see if he was there, but he was not. He then drove over to Kayla's place, and she was not there either. None of this made any sense, so he called the police and reported them missing. The police started their investigation with absolutely no leads. To begin, they decided to interview everyone in Charlie and Kayla's lives, including friends, family, acquaintances, employers, and coworkers, but nobody had any idea where the couple had gone. They had not told anyone about any trip they were going on, and they had not mentioned doing anything unusual. It seemed like they had just vanished. Initially, this investigation got nowhere. But 2 months after they were reported missing, the police finally obtained a search warrant that allowed them to look at their cell phone records. When they looked at Kayla's cell phone records, they were able to triangulate roughly where her last known location was, according to the signals her cell phone was sending off to nearby cell phone towers. And when they got the results, they discovered that her last known location was inside the exact same 95-acre plot of land that the Coxies had been in before they went missing. Immediately, the police put in a request for an emergency search warrant to go search this 95-acre property. They sent a team of officers out to the property, and they actually set up outside that big chain link fence and just waited for the search warrant to clear. At the exact same time, another group of police officers went to Todd Cap's house, which was actually in town, about 20 minutes away from this property, to talk to him about why in the world Kayla's cell phone would be pinging inside of his land. When the police arrived at his front doorstep, Todd was obviously caught off guard by suddenly having all these officers at his home. He understood very quickly how unbelievably suspicious it looked that now two different couples had gone onto his property right before they vanished. He looked at the officers and told them that he knew how this looked, but he insisted he had nothing to hide. He told them that he did hire Kayla and her boyfriend had come along with her. He said they went on his property, did some work for him, cleared some brush, and then he paid them and they left. He claimed that was the last he saw of them and that he had no idea why her phone would still be on his property. At the same time that the team of officers was grilling Todd at his house, the other team, waiting outside the 95-acre property, found out that their search warrant had been officially granted. They wasted no time. They flew through the gate, got onto the dirt access road, and began driving fast into this huge forest. As they were driving, they pulled out the maps they had printed, which showed the rough estimation of where Kayla's final cell phone signal was located. It looked like the last spot was inside a clearing. As they drove down the access road through all the thick trees, they saw a clearing up ahead, and it looked very much like the clearing on their map. When they pulled into the clearing, they saw two green buildings off to the left side of the road. The building on the left was like a shed, the kind of place where you might keep yard tools like lawnmowers, shovels, and rakes. But right next to it, on the right, was a large metal shipping container. It had heavy metal chains wrapped around it, and there were 5 heavy padlocks keeping it shut. The police immediately thought that Kayla might be inside one of these buildings, as this was likely where her last cell phone ping had come from. Right away, they went inside the wooden building on the left because it was much easier to get into since there were no padlocks on it. But when they got inside, they found nothing of note. Kayla was not in there, Charlie was not in there, and there was no cell phone. It was just a regular shed filled with gardening tools. So they went over to the metal shipping container on the right. They got out their metal cutting power saws and their bolt cutters and began cutting through all the chains and padlocks. When they finally managed to get the heavy door open, they were absolutely astounded by what they saw inside. Inside the dark metal shipping container, the police discovered Kayla. She was in extremely rough shape. She had a thick metal chain wrapped around her neck, and that chain was anchored directly to the wall of the shipping container. She was also handcuffed, but she was alive. The officers rushed inside to help her. They told her to stay calm and that they were going to get her out of there. One officer asked her what her name was, and she told them her name was Kayla. They quickly used their cutters to free her from the chains and carried her out to the waiting paramedics. After they got her out of the shipping container and got her stabilized, Kayla told the police the terrifying story of what had happened to her. She said that back on August 31st, 2016, she had been contacted by Todd Cap, who told her that he was still looking for people to come out and help clean up his property because he was getting ready to develop it. Kayla was looking for work, so she agreed to do it. After getting the job, Kayla told her boyfriend, Charlie, about it. Charlie was a very supportive boyfriend, and he told her that he would tag along to help her do the job. He said he would not even ask Todd for any money, and that he just wanted to help her out. Kayla was thrilled, and later that day, they made their way out to the 95-acre property. They reached the chain link fence, found the break, hopped onto the access road, and drove deep into the forest. After driving for several minutes, they reached the clearing. They saw Todd standing up ahead on the left, smiling and waving at them right in front of the wooden shed and the metal shipping container. Charlie parked the car directly in front of Todd. He and Kayla got out of the car and walked up to Todd to see what he wanted them to do. But as soon as they were standing in front of him, Todd casually pulled out a gun and shot Charlie 3 times in the chest. As soon as Charlie fell to the ground, Todd pointed the gun at Kayla and told her that if she tried to run, he would kill her and he would kill her family. Todd then put the gun away, walked over to Charlie, wrapped his body in a blue tarp, and carried him over to a nearby tractor, dumping his body inside the front bucket. Todd then walked back over to Kayla, who was so terrified she could not even move. He drew his gun again and ordered her to go inside the shipping container. He locked her inside, and for 65 days, she remained his prisoner in the dark. Over the course of those 65 days, Todd would come down to the property once or twice a day and do whatever he wanted with her. He warned her that if she ever tried to resist or fight back, he would kill her and her family. Because of this, Kayla decided very early on that she would not put up a fight. She chose to comply in order to protect her family, fully expecting that Todd would eventually grow tired of her and kill her anyway. She truly did not believe she would ever be rescued. After Kayla finished telling the officers this horrifying story, they immediately radioed the other team of police officers who were still at Todd Cap's house. They told them everything Kayla had said. The confrontation and Todd's arrest were captured on police video. The officers confronted Todd, telling him that they had found Kayla locked in a container on his property and that she had accused him of shooting Charlie and burying his body. At first, Todd denied everything, claiming he had nothing to do with it and that he did not lock anyone up. But the police arrested him on the spot and put him in the back of a patrol car. Even though Todd initially denied any wrongdoing, he eventually confessed. He admitted to killing Charlie and kidnapping Kayla, but then he went even further. He confessed to killing Johnny and Megan Coxey as well. He told the investigators that he had lured the Coxeys onto his property using the exact same promise of work. When they reached the buildings in the clearing, he drew his gun and shot Johnny, killing him instantly. He then ordered Megan to go inside the shipping container. But unlike Kayla, Megan refused to comply. She fought back with everything she had and was completely resistant to him. This made Todd furious. After only 5 days of keeping her locked up, he decided to kill her. He casually described her to police by saying that she was acting like a wild animal, so he had to put a bullet in the back of her head. He had absolutely no remorse for what he had done to them. The police would later search the property and find the bodies of Charlie, Johnny, and Megan buried in shallow graves right outside the shipping container. Knowing that he was facing multiple charges of first-degree murder, Todd realized he was highly likely to face the death penalty. He wanted to avoid execution, so he made a deal with the prosecutors. He told them that if they agreed to take the death penalty off the table, he would confess to even more murders that the police had never solved. The police and prosecutors agreed to the deal, and Todd began to speak. He confessed that back in 2003, he had walked into a local motorbike shop in Spartanburg and gunned down 4 staff members. The reason he did it was incredibly petty. Todd explained that a few days before the shooting, he had gone into the shop and the employees had made a snide remark about how he was bad at riding motorcycles. It was meant to be a harmless joke, but Todd took it as a massive personal insult. He could not let it go. So, in broad daylight, he went back to the shop with a gun and shot all 4 employees. After they fell, he walked up to each one of them and fired an extra bullet into their heads to make sure they were dead. As Todd told the story, he was completely casual and even laughed about it. He bragged to the detectives, telling them they should be proud of how quickly he cleared the shop, as if they would appreciate his efficiency. These 4 murders were the only additional ones Todd officially confessed to, which was enough to spare him from the death penalty. But investigators believe his actual victim count is much higher. While Kayla was held captive in the shipping container, Todd had bragged to her that his actual body count was in the high 2 digits. He likely told her this because he never expected her to leave that shipping container alive. But because she survived, his secrets were finally exposed to the world. After Todd's arrest, the details of his life began to emerge, and one of the most disturbing discoveries involved his online activity. Someone discovered that Todd had an anonymous Amazon account where he regularly posted product reviews. The items he reviewed were highly specific tools like knives, shovels, chainsaws, and padlocks. But it was the content of his reviews that was truly bone-chilling. Todd had written detailed reviews about how he planned to use these tools to kill people, or how he had already used them to dispose of bodies. In one review for a set of heavy-duty padlocks, he wrote that he had 5 of them on a shipping container, and he noted that it was just like the song Hotel California. Hotel California, the famous song by the Eagles, has a well-known line that says you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. It was a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a monster who was actively bragging about his crimes online while his victims were trapped on his property. Ultimately, Todd Cap was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will spend the remainder of his days locked away in a maximum security prison, unable to ever hurt anyone else. But for the families of Johnny and Megan Coxey and Charlie Carver, the pain of their loss will never truly go away. And for Kayla, the trauma of those 65 days in the dark will remain with her forever. The unanswered questions about how many other victims might still be out there in those woods continue to haunt the community to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.